My name is Camille. I am 34 years old, and I have spent the last decade building an empire out of the ashes my family left me in. I thought I could attend my younger sister's engagement party and simply blend into the background. But as the champagne flowed at the elite country club, my mother pulled me directly in front of the groom's billionaire father. "Oh, this is my other daughter," she announced with a sickeningly sweet smile. "She cleans floors for a living." My father chuckled, telling the billionaire that every family has a disappointment. But the groom's father did not. His smile completely vanished as he stared at the thick, jagged scar across my left palm. He stood up slowly and said, "Could I speak with you outside?" Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to endure the toxic shadow of a golden child sibling. The Pinecrest Country Club was drowning in the scent of expensive floral arrangements and roasted prime rib. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the 200 guests who had gathered to celebrate the social event of the season. My younger sister Brittany was finally securing the ultimate prize. At 29 years old, she was engaged to Spencer Thornton. The Thornton name carried a weight in our city that bordered on royalty. They were old money possessing the kind of generational wealth that my parents Beatrice and Gerald had spent their entire lives desperately trying to emulate. I stood quietly near a marble pillar at the edge of the ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water. I wore a simple tailored black dress that intentionally drew no attention. I was perfectly content to remain a ghost in the room. For as long as I could remember, my role in the family was to be the invisible backdrop against which Brittany could shine. Growing up, our home was a battlefield where I was constantly measured against her and found lacking. She was the golden child pampered and praised for breathing, while I was the scapegoat blamed for every inconvenience and criticized for every choice. I had learned long ago that blending into the wallpaper was the safest way to survive a family gathering. Spencer Thornton stood near the center of the room, looking dashing in a custom tuxedo. He was laughing at something Brittany had said. She was draped over his arm, wearing a heavily beaded designer gown that sparkled aggressively under the lights. She looked like a woman who had just won the lottery, and in many ways she had. My parents were hovering nearby, practically vibrating with pride. Beatrice wore a loud emerald green dress that demanded attention, while Gerald trailed behind her with a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. They were working the room, making sure every influential guest knew that their daughter was about to become a Thornton. I watched them with a detached sense of calm. I had not lived under their roof for 12 years. I had survived being cast out with absolutely nothing, navigating my 20s with a fierce determination to never rely on anyone else again. I had built a highly successful historical architectural restoration firm called Ethel Restoration. My company handled multi-million-dollar preservation projects for elite clients, but my family knew nothing about my success. During a rare brief phone call years ago, I had casually mentioned working with old floorboards and historic dust. Beatrice had immediately jumped to the conclusion that I was a janitor. I never corrected her. Letting them believe I was a failure was far easier than subjecting my real life to their endless scrutiny and sabotage. I took a slow sip of my water, planning my exit strategy. I figured I would wait another 20 minutes, slip my gift onto the receiving table, and quietly call for my car. But my mother possessed a predatory instinct when it came to me. As if sensing my desire to leave, Beatrice turned her head, her eyes scanning the periphery of the ballroom. When her gaze locked onto mine, a familiar cold knot formed in my stomach. I saw the triumphant smirk touch her lips. She whispered something to Gerald, and together they began to weave through the crowd, heading directly toward the private seating area where Spencer Thornton was resting. Harrison Thornton was a deeply intimidating man. He was the patriarch of the Thornton Empire, a billionaire whose quiet demeanor commanded absolute respect. He sat in a high-backed velvet chair, nursing a drink, looking politely bored by the extravagant display around him. Beatrice did not walk toward me. Instead, she positioned herself right next to Harrison, effectively cutting off my path to the exit. She waved her hand, gesturing for me to come over. It was a summons I could not ignore without causing the exact type of scene she wanted. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression into a mask of total neutrality, and walked across the ballroom floor. As I approached, Beatrice reached out and gripped my arm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug sharply into my skin, a physical warning to behave. She pulled me forward, forcing me to stand directly in the line of sight of Harrison Thornton. Harrison looked up, his expression unreadable but courteous. He had likely been subjected to 100 similar introductions tonight, meeting countless relatives, eager to secure a connection to his wealth. Beatrice smiled, a wide, artificial expression that did not reach her cold eyes. "Oh, Harrison," she announced, her voice pitched loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "This is my other daughter, Camille. She cleans floors for a living." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. It was a masterclass in public humiliation. She delivered the insult with a sickeningly sweet tone, framing it as if she were a long-suffering mother, bravely enduring the embarrassment of a wayward child. She wanted to show the billionaire that the family possessed the grace to invite the black sheep to such a prestigious event. Gerald stood right behind her, swirling the ice in his whiskey glass. He chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that carried across the quiet seating area. "Every family has a disappointment," he added smoothly, shaking his head as if I were an inside joke they all shared. Just then Brittany walked over, her arm looped tightly through Spencer's. She had clearly seen the interaction unfolding and could not resist joining the spectacle. She leaned her head against her fiancé's shoulder and gave me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Her eyes sparkled with malice. She had won the ultimate societal prize, and in her mind I was nothing more than the dirt on her expensive shoes. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt the curious, pitying stares of the nearby guests boring into my skin. The old Camille, the scared 22-year-old girl who just wanted her parents to love her, would have crumbled. She would have flushed red, stammered a pathetic excuse, and run from the room in tears. But that girl was long gone. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my chin held high. I did not drop my gaze, nor did I offer a single word of defense. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me bleed. I was the master of my own life, a self-made woman who commanded job sites and negotiated with city leaders. Their petty high society cruelty meant nothing to me. I remained completely stoic, choosing silence as my armor, refusing to react to their toxic bait. I could feel Beatrice waiting for me to crack, Brittany waiting for me to look ashamed, and Gerald enjoying the little performance he had helped create. Harrison, however, was no longer looking at my mother. His attention had shifted to me with a strange, almost clinical intensity. A waiter passed behind me carrying a tray of champagne. I stepped slightly to the side to let him through and reached for a flute, more out of instinct than desire. As my fingers closed around the stem, my left hand turned upward beneath the chandelier light. Harrison stopped breathing. His shoulders went rigid. His eyes dropped to my palm and locked on the thick, jagged scar that cut diagonally from the base of my thumb toward the outer edge of my hand. "Your hand," he said. Beatrice blinked. "Oh, that Camille has always been careless. Working around dirty construction sites will do that to a person." Harrison did not even glance at her. "Please open your hand again." His voice was quiet, but there was enough authority in it to silence everyone standing nearby. I slowly turned my palm upward. The color drained from his face. Brittany gave an impatient little laugh. "Honestly, Harrison, it is just an ugly old scar. Camille has had it forever." "How long?" he asked. The question was directed at me. 12 years. His eyes snapped to mine. "Could I speak with you outside?" Beatrice's mouth curved into a satisfied smile so quickly she did not even try to hide it. She leaned toward Brittany, as though the two of them had just watched a prediction come true. "Of course," my mother said before I could answer. "Camille understands. Harrison is very protective of his family's reputation." Brittany smirked and squeezed Spencer's arm. "Try not to make this more embarrassing than it already is." Spencer said nothing. I looked at Harrison. "All right," I said. He turned toward the glass doors leading to the terrace. I followed him through them, leaving my family behind in the warm glow of the ballroom. The doors closed, muffling the music and conversation until only a distant hum remained. The night air was cool against my skin. Harrison walked several steps toward the stone railing before turning around. "Where did you get that scar?" I kept my voice even. "Why? Please." His composure was beginning to fracture. "I need you to tell me exactly how it happened." I studied him carefully. "It was an accident." "What kind of accident?" "A car crash." His jaw tightened. "Where?" "On a rural road outside the city, 12 years ago. It was raining hard." Harrison took one slow step closer. "Were you in the vehicle?" "No." "Then how did your hand get cut?" The questions were coming too quickly now, each one sharper than the last. I could have refused to answer, but the expression on his face stopped me. This was not curiosity. I was trying to confirm something he was almost afraid to believe. I rested my scarred hand against the cold stone railing. "I was 22, I said. "My parents had thrown me out that week." His eyes flickered. "They accused me of stealing jewelry from the house. They filed a police report and told me that if I came back they would have me arrested. I had nowhere to go, so I was sleeping in my car and trying to stay out of sight." Harrison said nothing. That night the rain was so heavy I could barely see through the windshield. I was driving because the parking lot where I had been sleeping started flooding. A luxury sedan passed me on the road. A few seconds later I saw its taillights disappear. Disappear where to over the edge. His fingers closed around the stone railing. I stopped my car and ran back. The sedan had gone through the barrier and rolled down into a ravine. By the time I reached it, the front end was already burning. Harrison's breathing became shallow. "There were 2 people inside," I continued. "The driver was not moving. I could not reach him. But there was a boy in the passenger seat. He was conscious, terrified. He was hitting the window and trying to get out, but the door was crushed against the ground." "How old? 14 maybe? Around that age?" Harrison turned his face away for a second. "The flames were spreading underneath the hood. I tried the passenger door, but it would not move. I picked up a rock and hit the side window. It barely cracked. The boy started screaming that he could feel the heat. I looked down at my palm. So I hit the glass again. Then I stopped thinking. I wrapped part of my jacket around my forearm and punched through the windshield near the passenger side. The glass shattered, but my hand went through with it. My fingers tightened unconsciously. It cut my palm open almost to the bone. There was blood everywhere. I remember seeing it run down my wrist, but I did not feel much at the time. I just reached through, cleared enough broken glass away, unlocked what I could from inside, and pulled at him until he came free. Harrison's eyes were shining now. The car was already filling with smoke. I dragged him away from it up the muddy slope. He could barely stand, so I put his arm over my shoulders and kept pulling. We made it behind the barrier. I paused, remembering the heat that had pressed against my back. Less than a minute later, the car went up completely. Harrison closed his eyes. The boy was crying. I stayed long enough to make sure he was breathing and that someone had called emergency services. Then I heard sirens. "And you left." It was not an accusation. It sounded like pain. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I thought the police were coming for me too." His expression tightened. My parents had filed a false report accusing me of stealing expensive jewelry. I was 22, homeless, terrified, and convinced that if an officer ran my name, I would be arrested before anyone listened to me. I had no lawyer, no money, no one to call. So when I heard the sirens getting closer, I panicked. "You walked away with your hand like that." I wrapped it in what was left of my jacket and drove until I found an all-night pharmacy. I bought antiseptic bandages and butterfly closures. I treated it myself in the back seat of my car. Harrison stared at the scar again. No hospital. No hospital. No police statement. No. No reward. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in his face. I did not even know who was in the car. I never learned the boy's name. I only knew he was alive when I left. The sounds from the ballroom seemed impossibly distant now. Harrison stood across from me as though the entire world had narrowed to the scar in my open palm. "I have never told my family the full story," I said. "They already believed I was a criminal. I saw no reason to give them another part of my life to twist into something ugly." His lips parted, but no words came. That is how I got the scar, Mr. Thornton. I let my hand fall back to my side. And that is everything I know about the boy I pulled from that car. Harrison stood perfectly still as my words hung in the cool night air. For a long moment, the only sound between us was the distant hum of the country club orchestra drifting through the glass doors. Then the impenetrable facade of the billionaire patriarch completely shattered. He brought a shaking hand up to cover his mouth, and a ragged, heavy sob tore through his chest. Tears spilled over his cheeks, catching the dim light of the terrace lanterns. I stepped back, utterly bewildered by the sheer rawness of his reaction. Men like Harrison Thornton did not break down in front of strangers. He took a staggering step toward me and fell to his knees right there on the hard stone patio. Mr. Thornton, I gasped, reaching out instinctively before pulling my hand back. Please, you need to stand up. He shook his head, his shoulders trembling as he looked up at me from the ground. That 14-year-old boy in the passenger seat was my youngest son. His name is Leo. The driver was our longtime chauffeur, and he died on impact that night. The police and fire investigators told me later that the flames consumed the cabin less than a minute after Leo was pulled free. If you had hesitated for even a fraction of a second, my son would have burned alive. I owe you the life of Leo. The air rushed out of my lungs. I stumbled backward until my hips hit the stone railing. The terrified teenager covered in mud, the boy whose panicked eyes had haunted my nightmares for over a decade, was Leo Thornton. I was the brother of the man my sister was about to marry. The sheer scale of the coincidence felt like the ground had dropped out from beneath my feet. I told you to stand up, I said, my voice trembling now. Please. Harrison slowly pushed himself up from the patio, pulling a pristine linen handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his eyes. His hands were still shaking violently. When I got to the hospital that night, he continued, his voice thick with unwept tears. Leo kept telling the nurses about an angel who punched through fire to save him. He was delirious with shock, but he kept talking about a woman whose hand was torn to shreds, bleeding all over his jacket as she dragged him up the muddy embankment. We tried to find you, Camille. I hired the best private investigators in the country. We checked every hospital, every urgent care clinic, every emergency room within a 200-mile radius of that ravine. We looked for anyone who had come in with severe lacerations to their hands or arms. We never found a single record. I treated the wound myself, I explained quietly, looking down at my scarred palm. I bought butterfly closures, bandages, and antiseptic from an all-night local pharmacy with the last few dollars I had. I sat in the back of my car, in a strip mall parking lot, and stitched my own hand together. I was so terrified that if I went to a hospital, they would run my name, see the false police report my parents filed, and have me arrested. I had to stay hidden. Harrison closed his eyes, a fresh wave of tears leaking from the corners. You stitched your own hand in a parking lot because you were terrified of the police, he repeated, the horror evident in his tone. Because of your family. The very people sitting inside that ballroom right now. The people who just mocked you in front of me. Yes, I said simply. My parents needed a scapegoat to protect Brittany, so they threw me to the wolves. They have spent the last 12 years ensuring I stayed exactly where they put me. A profound shift occurred in his stoic expression. The overwhelming grief and relief morphed into something else entirely. It was a cold, calculating anger, the kind of quiet fury that built empires and destroyed enemies. He looked back toward the glowing glass doors of the ballroom, staring at the silhouettes of the wealthy guests mingling inside. They just called you a floor cleaner, he stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Your mother paraded you in front of me like a shameful secret, hoping to score social points by humiliating you. She introduced the savior of my family, the woman who walked through fire for my son, as a disappointment. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of vindication washing over me. They thrive on tearing me down, Mr. Thornton. They believe I am nothing. They believe I am completely beneath them and the prestigious family they are marrying into. Harrison turned back to face me, his eyes burning with an intense protective fire. He reached out and gently took my scarred left hand in both of his. He did not grip it like a business partner. He held it with the reverence of a father holding a sacred relic. His thumbs lightly traced the jagged white line running across my palm, and he bowed his head over my hand. "You have been carrying this mark alone for 12 years," he said softly, his voice echoing with absolute sincerity. "You sacrificed your own safety, your own body to save a child you did not even know. You vanished into the night asking for no reward, no recognition, and no praise. You just gave me my son back and disappeared into the shadows." "I did what anyone would have done," I replied, uncomfortable with the sudden influx of praise. "I am not a hero." "You are the only hero I have ever met," he countered fiercely. He released my hand but kept his piercing gaze locked on mine. "And those people inside, those arrogant, cruel people who dare to call themselves your parents, they have absolutely no idea who they are dealing with. They have no idea what you truly did then." "I am going back in there right now," he declared, his voice suddenly booming with authority. "I am going to march up to that stage, stop the music, and tell every single person in that ballroom exactly who you really are. I will write you a check for $10 million tonight, Camille. I will set you up for life. No one will ever disrespect you again." He turned toward the heavy glass doors, fully intending to unleash a storm upon the engagement party. I lunged forward and grabbed his arm. My grip was firm, pulling him back into the shadows of the terrace. "No," I said, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You simply cannot do that, Mr. Thornton." He stared at me in pure disbelief. "Why on earth not? They humiliated you tonight. They discarded you completely. You saved my family, and they treat you like absolute dirt. I have the power to fix this instantly." I released his arm and took a deliberate step back, smoothing the fabric of my black dress. "I appreciate the sentiment, I truly do. But I do not want your money. I certainly do not want you to interrupt that party." Harrison looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. He shook his head, clearly struggling to comprehend my refusal. "Camille, you are living a life of hardship because of them. Your mother just told me you clean floors for a living. You stitched your own hand in a parking lot to survive. Let me help you." A quiet laugh escaped my lips. The sheer absurdity of the situation finally caught up with me. I looked out over the manicured lawns of the country club before looking back at the billionaire patriarch. "I am not struggling, Mr. Thornton," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "My mother is a very bitter, very creative liar. It is true that I deal with floors occasionally, but usually only when I am personally inspecting the restoration of 18th-century mahogany parquetry." Harrison furrowed his brow, stepping closer. "What are you talking about? I am the founder and chief executive officer of Ethel Restoration," I stated, watching his eyes widen as the prestigious name finally registered. I knew he would recognize it. Ethel Restoration was not a small local operation. Over the past 12 years, I had built the firm from the ground up, starting with tiny historical society grants and scaling up to massive commercial preservation contracts. We handled the meticulous restoration of heritage buildings across the state. My team consisted of master carpenters, stonemasons, and architectural historians. I managed budgets in the tens of millions. "You own Ethel Restoration?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping to a stunned whisper. "I read an article about your firm in an architectural journal last month. You just completed the courthouse renovation downtown." "We finished it under budget and 2 weeks ahead of schedule," I confirmed proudly. "I built that company with my own 2 hands. The same hands my parents think are only good for pushing a mop. My firm restores historic mosaic tile floors. I am not a janitor, Mr. Thornton. I am a self-made CEO." Harrison stood completely paralyzed as the layers of my parents' deception peeled away. The color drained from his face as he realized the sheer magnitude of their malice. They did not just kick out a vulnerable 22-year-old girl. They actively suppressed and mocked a highly successful woman simply because she threatened the fabricated narrative they had built around Brittany. "They lied to my face," he said, his tone turning dangerously cold. "They looked me dead in the eye and tried to humiliate a brilliant business owner because they wanted to elevate their other daughter. They have spent their entire lives trying to convince the world that Brittany is the only child worth acknowledging," I explained. "If they admit I am successful, it means admitting they were wrong to throw me away. It means acknowledging that I built an empire without a single dime of their money, while they had to finance every single one of Brittany's failed business ventures before she finally caught your son. Harrison turned away, pacing a short length of the stone patio. He ran a hand over his face, processing the massive implications of everything I had just revealed. His son Spencer was inside that ballroom right now, smiling and toasting to a future with a family built entirely on fraud and manipulation. "This changes everything," Harrison muttered, stopping to grip the stone railing. "Spencer is blinded by infatuation. He thinks Brittany is a sweet, sophisticated woman from a respectable family. He has no idea he is marrying into a den of vipers." I stayed silent, allowing him to reach his own conclusions. I had no desire to save Spencer from his own poor judgment, but I also understood the protective instinct of a father who had almost lost everything once before. Harrison turned back to me, his eyes flashing with a cold new strategic light. The vulnerable, grieving father from a few moments ago was entirely gone. In his place stood the ruthless corporate titan who had built the Thornton empire from scratch. "Camille," he said, his voice sharp and focused, "I need to know the absolute truth about the people my son is marrying into. I need to know if Brittany and her parents are genuinely interested in Spencer, or if they are simply hungry for Thornton wealth. If they are willing to lie so easily about their own flesh and blood, I can only imagine what they are hiding from us. They are drawn to money and status above all else," I warned him. "But proving it to Spencer will not be easy. He is completely under her spell." Harrison nodded slowly, a plan forming. "Then we do not tell him yet. We do not tell anyone." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his sudden shift in demeanor. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting a silent alliance," Harrison said, closing the distance between us. "I want to test them. I want to put them in positions where their true greed and superficiality cannot be hidden. I want to see how they behave when they think no one important is watching. But to do that, I need you to maintain your cover. I need you to let them keep believing you are just the disappointing floor cleaner." I crossed my arms, considering the proposition. The prospect of finally exposing my family's true nature to the very people they were trying to impress held a deep, undeniable appeal. I had spent 12 years ignoring their jabs, taking the high road, and letting them control the narrative. Perhaps it was time to let them dig their own graves. "You want me to play the scapegoat?" I asked, my tone cautious. "I want you to be my eyes and ears," Harrison corrected. "You know their tactics. You know their weaknesses. If I announce your success right now, they will immediately backtrack. Beatrice and Gerald will pretend they always supported you. Brittany will play the loving sister to secure her spot in our family. They will pivot and adapt because they are parasites. We cannot give them the chance to change their strategy." He extended his right hand toward me. "Keep the secret, Camille. Do not tell them about the car crash. Do not tell them about Leo. And most importantly, do not tell them about Ethel Restoration. Let them continue to underestimate you. When the time is right, we will spring the trap together, and we will burn their false narrative to the ground." I looked at his outstretched hand. The cool night air whipped around us. My mother was probably holding court right now, bragging about her upcoming connection to billionaire wealth. Brittany was likely basking in the glow of her stolen triumph. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully humiliated me and secured their perfect future. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had just turned into a sinkhole. I reached out and grasped Harrison Thornton's hand. His grip was firm, resolute, and filled with a silent promise of absolute ruin for the people who had wronged us both. "We have a deal, Mr. Thornton," I said, matching his intense gaze. "I will keep your secret, and we will see exactly what my family is made of." "Excellent," he replied, a dark, satisfied smile touching his lips. "Please call me Harrison. We are partners now." He released my hand and adjusted his suit jacket, his billionaire armor sliding perfectly back into place. "We should return to the party before they come looking for us. Let us go give your mother the exact performance she is expecting." I nodded, smoothing my own dress and following him back toward the heavy glass doors. The engagement party was still in full swing, the guests entirely oblivious to the pact that had just been sealed in the shadows. I walked back into the bright light of the ballroom, my scarred left hand resting quietly at my side, ready to play my part in the destruction of my family's golden empire. The morning sunlight filtered through the frosted glass windows of my secondary field office located on the ground floor of a repurposed brick warehouse. While the corporate headquarters for Ethel Restoration occupied a pristine high-rise across the city, I preferred this gritty satellite office when prepping for bids. It smelled of aged timber drafting paper and strong coffee. I was sitting at a massive wooden table reviewing structural blueprints with my business partner Felix. We were going over the load-bearing columns of a historic theater we were scheduled to bid on soon. I wore a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark slacks, my hair pulled back into a practical knot. The glamour and tension of the country club the night before felt like a bizarre fever dream, but the memory of my handshake with Harrison Thornton anchored me. I was quietly sipping my coffee, running my finger along a faded ink line on the blueprint, when the heavy metal door swung open with an aggressive thud. The sudden noise echoed off the exposed brick walls. Felix looked up from his architectural scale, frowning at the intrusion. I did not need to look to know who had just crossed the threshold. The overwhelming scent of expensive floral perfume and the sharp staccato click of designer heels announced their arrival before they even spoke. I slowly raised my head and watched my mother and sister march into the workspace. Beatrice wore a pristine cream-colored pantsuit that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of industrial drafting tables and scattered hard hats. Brittany trailed half a step behind her, clutching a crocodile skin handbag, like a shield, looking around the room with an expression of profound disgust. She wrinkled her nose as she took in the sight of drywall samples and wood-stain palettes. "Well, this certainly explains the smell," my mother announced, projecting her voice. She stopped a few feet from my drafting table, refusing to step closer. "It looks exactly like the kind of place someone of your status would hide away in. You really have settled for a life of grime, have you not, Camille?" I placed my pen down on the blueprints, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. Felix shot me a questioning glance, but I gave him a subtle nod, signaling that I had this under control. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Good morning to you too, Mother. I see you and Brittany survived the terrible ordeal of the engagement party. What brings you to my side of town so early on a Monday? I highly doubt you came to admire the masonry in this neighborhood." Beatrice narrowed her eyes. "Do not use that sarcastic tone with me. We are here because of the absolute disaster you caused last night. I warned your father that inviting you to a high society function would be a catastrophic mistake, but he insisted we extend an olive branch. And how do you repay us? You humiliate us in front of the most powerful family in the state." I kept my expression neutral, remembering the secret pact I had made on the terrace. I needed to let them believe their own narrative. "How exactly did I humiliate you?" I asked, feigning mild confusion. "I stood exactly where you placed me. I did not speak out of turn. I did not spill my drink. I simply existed in the same room as your wealthy friends." Brittany scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You existed like a stray dog begging for scraps. Did you honestly think Harrison Thornton wanted to talk to you? The entire ballroom saw him drag you outside. Everyone knew he was reprimanding you. He was absolutely disgusted that Spencer is marrying a woman whose sister cleans up construction sites. You practically reeked of poverty, and he smelled it on you the second he saw you." The sheer delusion of her statement was almost comical, but I maintained my mask of quiet submission. They actually believed Harrison had taken me onto the terrace to scold me for being poor. They were convinced that the billionaire patriarch was horrified by my lack of status, rather than awestruck by my history with his youngest son. It was the perfect cover for our new alliance. "I am sure Mr. Thornton will recover from the trauma of meeting me," I replied, keeping my voice soft and deferential. "We had a very brief conversation and then I left. I doubt he will even remember my name by tomorrow." Beatrice stepped forward, her pristine heels clicking sharply against the concrete. "Do not try to minimize the damage you have done, Camille. Harrison Thornton is a man of exacting standards. He expects perfection from the people associating with his family. When he pulled you outside, he was sending a very clear message to Gerald and me. He was telling us that your presence is a liability. You brought shame to our family name. You made us look like we associate with low-class workers, and that reflects poorly on Brittany." Brittany nodded, clutching her designer handbag. "Spencer was asking questions this morning. He wanted to know why his father seemed so intense after talking to you." I had to make up a story about how you struggle with social situations and how Harrison was probably just trying to give you a polite reality check. Do you know how exhausting it is to cover up your failures, Camille? I am trying to plan the wedding of the century, and I have to waste my time doing damage control because you cannot even pretend to be civilized for one evening. I let out a slow breath, watching the two women who shared my blood, but possessed none of my loyalty. The entitlement radiating from them was staggering. They had driven across the city, not to check on my well-being, or to apologize for their cruel introduction the night before, but to punish me for a fictional offense they had fabricated in their own minds. If my presence is such a terrible burden to you both, I said quietly, why did you bother coming here today? You could have simply ignored me like you have for the past 12 years. You could have just gone back to pretending I do not exist. Beatrice reached into her tailored handbag and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. She tossed it onto the blueprints with a sharp slap. We came here because your actions require penance, she stated, her voice dripping with venomous authority. You caused immense emotional distress to your sister on what was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. You endangered her standing with the Thornton family. You owe us for the damage you have done. I looked down at the pristine white envelope resting on the dusty drafting table. What is this? I asked, making no move to touch it. It is the final invoice from the floral designer for the wedding reception. Brittany answered, a greedy smirk spreading across her face. We are upgrading the centerpieces for the main dining hall because the Thornton family expects a specific caliber of elegance. Since you will not be invited to the actual wedding due to your complete lack of social grace, Mother and Dad decided that you can contribute financially instead. It is the least you can do to make up for nearly ruining my engagement party. I stared at the envelope, feeling a cold wave of disbelief wash over me. I reached out and flipped the flap open, pulling out the thick cardstock invoice. The total at the bottom of the page was printed in bold black ink, $15,000. They were demanding that I pay $15,000 for flowers I would never see at a wedding. I was explicitly banned from attending. The sheer audacity of their sudden demand hung heavy in the tense silence of the field office. They stood there bathed in morning sunlight, expecting me to simply bow my head and hand over my earned money. I looked down at the piece of paper detailing exotic orchids and imported silk ribbons. Then I looked up at the two women who had made my childhood a living nightmare. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up the invoice by its corner and slid it back across the drafting table toward my mother. I will not be paying this, I said, my tone perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. I owe you nothing, Beatrice. I certainly owe nothing to a sister who treats me like a disease. You can fund your own extravagant floral arrangements. Beatrice stared at the invoice resting near her manicured hand and snapped her gaze up to meet mine. Brittany let out a sharp gasp, stepping forward so quickly her heels scraped the concrete floor. Are you out of your mind? Brittany demanded, her voice climbing to a shrill pitch. You are the one who embarrassed us in front of Harrison Thornton. You owe us for the damage you caused. Use whatever pathetic wage you scrape together and pay this bill right now. I remained seated in my chair, keeping my posture relaxed. My presence at your party was requested by our parents, I reminded her calmly. If my mere existence is such a catastrophic embarrassment, then take that up with them. I am not opening my checkbook to soothe your bruised ego, Brittany. I am not financing your desperate attempt to impress the Thornton family. Now please take your invoice and leave my office. I have actual work to do today. The casual dismissal struck a nerve deep within my sister. For her entire life, she had been given exactly what she wanted the moment she raised her voice. Being denied by the sister she viewed as entirely inferior was a shock to her system. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. You think you are so smart, she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You are nothing, Camille. You are a glorified janitor. Before my mother could restrain her, Brittany took another aggressive step forward. Her eyes darted wildly around my workspace, searching for a way to inflict damage. To my right sat a glass display case resting on a sturdy oak pedestal. Inside the case were fragile hand-painted terracotta tiles. We had spent weeks carefully excavating them from a historic property. Brittany saw the case and her lips curled into a vicious sneer. She lunged toward the pedestal, raising her designer handbag high into the air. I shouted for her to stop pushing my chair back, but I was a second too late. Brittany swung her heavy crocodile skin bag with all her might, bringing it crashing down against the side of the glass display. The impact was loud and sharp. The glass enclosure shattered instantly, sending glittering shards exploding across the concrete floor. The oak pedestal tipped over entirely. The antique terracotta tiles hit the hard ground with a sickening crunch. The irreplaceable historical artifacts fractured into dozens of jagged, irreparable pieces. A cloud of ancient dust puffed into the air, settling over the wreckage. Brittany stood over the destroyed display, her chest heaving as she breathed heavily. A triumphant, malicious smile spread across her face as she looked at the broken pieces of history scattered at her feet. "Maybe that will teach you how to speak to your betters," she spat. "You can sweep that up along with the rest of the trash in this place. Cleaning up messes is the only thing you are actually good at." I was out of my chair in an instant, my hands balled into tight fists. The fury I had been suppressing finally threatened to boil over. But before I could take a step toward my sister, a large shadow fell over the drafting table. Felix had been sitting quietly in the corner, observing the entire interaction with growing disbelief. Now he stood up to his imposing height. He walked deliberately around the table, his heavy work boots crunching loudly over the shattered glass and broken terracotta. Felix stopped directly between me and Brittany, using his large frame to shield me. He looked down at the ruined artifacts, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. He did not match her hysterical energy. Instead, his voice was dangerously calm and low. "You just destroyed protected historical property," he stated, staring directly into her eyes. "You have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out that door before I call building security and have you physically detained. When police arrive, I will happily press charges for vandalism and destruction of private property." The threat of police involvement and public scandal acted like a bucket of ice water thrown directly at my shocked mother. Beatrice panicked, stepping forward quickly to grab Brittany by the arm and pull her back away from Felix. She knew perfectly well that a police report detailing property destruction would be a catastrophic social disaster with the high-profile wedding approaching. She shot Felix a venomous glare, but did not dare challenge the physical intimidation he projected. "We are leaving," Beatrice announced, her voice trembling slightly as she tugged her reluctant golden child toward the exit. But Beatrice could not leave without attempting to secure the final word. She stopped at the heavy metal door, turning back to face me from across the room. Her eyes were dark with a promise of absolute ruin. "You think you have won today, Il," she said, her tone dropping to a cold, malicious whisper. "You think you can disrespect your family and hide away in this pathetic little cleaning business without facing consequences. You have made a massive mistake. You have no idea the influence your father and I possess in this city." I stood beside Felix, watching her deliver her ultimatum. Beatrice gripped the door handle, her knuckles white. "We sit on the boards of the most exclusive country clubs in the state," she continued, her voice dripping with toxic authority. "We dine with city council members and real estate developers. By the time I am finished making a few phone calls, no one will ever hire your miserable little company again. I will make sure you are completely blacklisted. I will see to it that your business is starved of every contract until you are begging us for help." Brittany chimed in from the hallway, her courage returning fully now that she was safely away from Felix. "You are going to lose everything, Camille," she taunted, a cruel laugh echoing through the corridor. "You should have just paid the floral bill. It would have been much cheaper for you." With that final pathetic threat, Beatrice pulled the heavy metal door shut behind them. The door slammed with a resounding metallic boom, vibrating the walls of the office. I stood still for a long moment, staring at the closed door, processing the sheer magnitude of the threat my mother had just issued. They truly believed they held the power to destroy my livelihood. I looked down at the floor, at the shattered glass and the ruined terracotta tiles. It was a mess, but it was a mess I could handle. Felix placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, giving it a supportive squeeze. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the residual adrenaline out of my entire system. I looked up at him, meeting his concerned gaze with a look of absolute iron resolve. "I am perfectly fine, Felix," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "Let them make their little phone calls. Let them try to ruin us. They are operating under the delusion that I am still a helpless child they can control. They have no idea what they have just unleashed. The rest of that week passed with a deceptive stillness. Felix and I threw ourselves into finalizing our bid for the Heritage Library project. It was a massive municipal contract, a cornerstone piece of architecture in the city center that required painstaking restoration of its vaulted ceilings and marble facades. Securing this project was not just about the revenue. It was a crown jewel for our portfolio that would cement Ethel Restoration as the premier firm in the region. We had already passed the preliminary review phases with flying colors. The Historical Society Board had informally assured us that our technical presentation was unmatched. I pushed my mother's threat to the back of my mind, assuming it was nothing more than the empty venom she always spewed when she did not get her way. I underestimated the depths of my father's complicity. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was at my desk reviewing the final budget projections when Felix walked into my office. His face was unusually pale, his jaw set in a tight line. He closed the door behind him and locked it, a gesture he reserved only for absolute emergencies. "We just received an email from the Historical Society Board of Directors," he said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. "They are officially rejecting our bid for the Heritage Library. They are pulling our firm from the approved contractor list effective immediately." I stared at him, the numbers on my screen suddenly blurring together. "That is impossible," I stated, standing up from my chair. "We had the highest technical score. The board director explicitly told me our preservation strategy for the marble facade was the only one that met federal historical guidelines. We are the most qualified firm in the state for this specific job. There has to be a mistake." Felix tossed a printed copy of the email onto my desk. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the formal, rigid language. They cited unforeseen complications with our firm's long-term stability. They are going with a commercial contractor who has zero historical preservation experience, but significantly more corporate backing. A cold sensation washed over me as the pieces clicked into place. My mother had not been making an empty threat. She had unleashed my father. Gerald was a man who operated entirely in the shadows of my mother's loud outbursts. He was a master of leveraging connections, a man who built his entire career on social climbing and backroom deals. He never yelled. He simply destroyed people quietly. I picked up my phone and bypassed the official board directory, dialing the direct cell phone number of the board president. Mr. Henderson had been a staunch supporter of our firm for years. He answered on the third ring, his voice guarded and uncomfortable. "Camille," he started, immediately sounding deeply apologetic. "I am sorry about the email. It was a decision made by the broader committee. I fought for your firm, but my hands were completely tied. I tried to push back, but the pressure was too immense." I kept my tone perfectly professional, masking the rising panic in my chest. "Mr. Henderson, we both know Ethel Restoration is the only firm capable of handling the vaulted ceilings without compromising the structural integrity. You told me yourself that the commercial contractor would ruin the acoustics. I need to know exactly what changed overnight. We deserve a transparent answer." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him shifting in his chair, the sound of his heavy breathing betraying his anxiety. "It is complicated, Camille. We rely heavily on private endowments to fund these municipal projects. Yesterday afternoon, the board received a call from someone representing a major real estate conglomerate. They strongly suggested that if we awarded the contract to your firm, a substantial amount of upcoming private funding for the library district would be permanently reallocated to other cities." My grip on the phone tightened. My knuckles turned white. "Who made the call?" Mr. Henderson hesitated, clearly fearing retaliation. "It was your father, Gerald. He made it very clear that he was speaking with the full backing of his future son-in-law, Spencer Thornton. He heavily implied that the Thornton real estate empire would financially blackball the Historical Society if we did business with you. He said your firm was a liability and that associating with you would sever our relationship with the Thornton family." The board panicked. "We cannot afford to lose Thornton funding, Camille. We just cannot risk it. I am so truly sorry." I thanked him for his honesty and ended the call. I set the phone down on my desk and looked at Felix, who had been listening to the conversation on speaker. Gerald had actually done it. He had weaponized the Thornton name, a name he had absolutely no legal right to use, to intimidate a municipal board into dropping my company. He had invoked Spencer's influence without Spencer or Harrison ever knowing about it, risking federal funding and my firm's reputation just to appease my mother's bruised ego. This was not just petty family drama anymore. This was a targeted, calculated attempt to destroy my livelihood. If Gerald succeeded in pulling the Thornton name to starve my business of this contract, he would not stop there. He would use the same tactic to systematically dismantle every single project we had lined up for the next 5 years. He was trying to crush me into submission, trying to force me to crawl back to my family begging for financial mercy. He wanted to break me. Felix leaned his hands against my desk, his eyes burning with outrage. He just committed tortious interference. Felix stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He is using a billionaire's name to threaten a municipal board and sabotage a federal contract. This is highly illegal. Your father just crossed a massive line. I nodded, the initial shock giving way to a razor-sharp focus. We are not letting them take this project, Felix. If we roll over and let them bully the board, it sets a precedent. They will destroy our reputation in this city piece by piece until we have nothing left. We are going to fight this with everything we have. We spent the next 4 exhausting hours locked in the office strategizing our counterattack. We contacted our corporate legal counsel, a brilliant and aggressive attorney who had helped us navigate complex preservation laws in the past. When we explained the situation, outlining how Gerald had falsely represented the Thornton real estate empire to threaten a government-funded organization, our lawyer immediately grasped the severity of the situation. We need to file an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning, our lawyer advised over the conference call. We have to legally freeze the board's decision to award the contract to the commercial firm. If we can prove tortious interference, we can halt the entire process and force the board to reinstate your bid. But to do that, we have to prove that Ethel Restoration is in absolute perfect standing. The board cited your firm's stability as their excuse for dropping you. We need to tear that excuse to shreds in front of a judge. I paced the length of my office, my mind working a mile a minute. What exactly do you need from us to make that happen? Tell me what to prepare. I need a completely transparent, bulletproof audit of your entire firm, the lawyer replied, his tone dead serious. I need your corporate history, your tax records, your employee retention rates, and most importantly, I need a flawless financial background check on both you and Felix as the primary owners. The judge will look for any legitimate reason the board might have had to drop you. If your personal and professional records are pristine, it proves the board acted solely under illegal duress from your father's threats. There can be absolutely zero red flags. We can provide all of that, Felix assured him without hesitation. We run a completely clean operation. We have zero debt, flawless credit, and perfect compliance records. I will authorize the deep background checks tonight and pull the financial archives from our accounting software. It will take me a few hours, but you will have the entire package on your desk before the courthouse opens tomorrow. We ended the call, the atmosphere in the office thick with determination. This was the high-stakes battle my parents had dared to provoke. They thought my firm was a flimsy little operation they could easily blow over with a single phone call. They thought I was still the terrified girl they had kicked out onto the street all those years ago. But I had spent 12 years building my armor. I was ready to drag them into a legal fight that would expose exactly what they were doing. I need you to pull everything. Felix, I said, moving to my filing cabinets to start gathering our physical records. Go back to the very beginning of the company. Leave no stone unturned. The lawyer wants a deep dive, so we give him everything. I want our financial standing to be so undeniably perfect that the judge has no choice but to grant the injunction. We are going to win this. Felix nodded, already pulling up the secure servers on his computer. I will run the highest security clearance background checks on both of our personal financial histories as well. It is standard protocol for federal contracts anyway. It will just take a few hours for the encrypted system to compile the full reports dating back to when we first opened our primary bank accounts. I will dig all the way back to exactly 12 years ago just to be extremely thorough. I agreed, feeling a surge of protective adrenaline for the company we had built together. I was not going to let my parents steal my life's work. I sat back down at my desk and began organizing the technical specs for the Heritage Library, ready to prove that no one else was qualified for the job. The legal fight had officially begun, and I was fully prepared to go to war against them. I had absolutely nothing to hide in my past. Or so I thought. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting dark shadows across the exposed brick walls of the field office. The ambient noise of city traffic faded into a quiet hum, leaving only the sound of Felix typing on his keyboard. I sat at my drafting table with the desk lamp illuminating the massive blueprints of the Heritage Library. I tried to force my brain to focus on the structural load capacities. I needed our technical presentation to be flawless for the judge tomorrow. If my father wanted to play dirty, I was going to bury him under undeniable competence. Despite my efforts to compartmentalize, a knot of anxiety sat heavy in my stomach. I knew my company was financially solvent and legally spotless. We paid our taxes early and never cut corners. I had spent 12 years ensuring no one could ever look at my life and find a flaw to exploit. Yet as the hours ticked by, the silence in the office grew tense. The high-security clearance background check Felix was running was incredibly thorough. It was the kind of deep financial audit reserved for federal defense contractors, designed to pull every footprint a person had ever left on the grid. It swept through old bank accounts, tax filings, and credit histories. I took a sip of my cold coffee, rubbing my tired eyes. I told myself it was standard procedure. There was nothing for the algorithm to find, except a straightforward trajectory of a woman who started with $0 and slowly built a multi-million-dollar company. At exactly 9 o'clock, the rhythmic clacking of Felix typing stopped. The abrupt silence made me look up from my blueprints. Felix was staring intently at his dual monitors, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The glow from the screens cast a pale light over his face, highlighting a look of profound confusion. He leaned closer to the monitor, highlighting a section of text with his mouse, reading it twice. "Camille," he said, his voice hesitant and quiet. "Did you ever use a different primary banking institution before we opened the corporate accounts for Ethel Restoration?" I pushed my chair back, stretching my stiff shoulders. "No," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "I have used the same local credit union since I was a teenager. I only switched to the commercial bank when we incorporated the business. Why do you ask? Is there a glitch in the software pulling someone else with my name?" Felix did not look away from the screen. He scrolled down further, his expression shifting from confusion to mild concern. "It is not a glitch," he stated softly. "The federal audit pulled your exact social security number and matched it to your historical addresses. It generated a complete financial timeline. But there is a massive red flag sitting right in the middle of your history. A red flag that contradicts everything you just told our lawyer about starting this company with zero capital." My heart gave a sudden uncomfortable lurch. I stood up and slowly walked around the drafting table. I moved to stand directly behind Felix, looking over his shoulder at the dense spreadsheet displayed on his screen. "What are you talking about, Felix?" I asked, my voice tightening. "I started this firm with $3,000 I saved from working double shifts at a diner. I lived in my car for 6 months. I have never had any hidden capital." Felix pointed a thick finger at a highlighted row of financial data. "Then you need to explain this to me, Camille," he said, his tone perfectly even, but laced with underlying tension. "Because according to this federal background check, you are the primary beneficiary of a high-yield trust fund. It looks like it was established by your maternal grandfather, but it was fully legally in your name." I stared at the screen, the words blurring for a fraction of a second before snapping into sharp focus. My grandfather had died when I was 19. My mother always told me he passed away completely bankrupt, leaving the family with nothing but funeral debts. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the columns of financial data. The account was established when I was a child. It sat accumulating high interest for years. I tracked my gaze across the screen to the column displaying the total asset value. My breath caught in my throat. The figure listed was $250,000. I gripped the back of Felix's chair to steady myself. The room suddenly felt entirely too warm, I swear to you on my life, I have absolutely no idea what that account is. I have never seen $250,000 in my entire personal life. My parents told me my grandfather died penniless. They made me pay for my own community college classes because they claimed they were financially ruined by his debts. I have never touched a trust fund. Felix turned in his chair to look up at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of deception. He knew me better than anyone. He knew the cheap instant noodles I ate for years to keep the business afloat. He saw the genuine shock and panic radiating from me, and his expression immediately softened. "I believe you, Camille," he said quietly. "But the judge tomorrow is not going to just take your word for it. This audit shows that a $250,000 trust was attached to your Social Security number. If we claim you are a self-made contractor, victimized by her wealthy family, and opposing counsel pulls this same record, they will paint you as a spoiled heiress who blew through a massive inheritance and is now lying to secure a municipal contract. It destroys our entire narrative of you being an independent operator. They will use this discrepancy to prove the board was right to drop our firm." I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck. I looked back at the screen, my mind racing to comprehend how $250,000 could exist in my name without my knowledge. If the account was in my name, where did the money go? I demanded, my voice shaking with fear. "Show me the transaction history. When was the account closed?" Felix turned back to the keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys as he accessed the deeper layers of the federal audit. A new window popped up on the screen displaying a finalized ledger. "The money did not trickle out slowly," Camille Felix stated, tracing the data line. "It was emptied in 3 massive wire transfers. The entire $250,000 was drained, and the account was closed." I stared at the final date. The bold black numbers seemed to burn into my retinas. The breath was knocked out of my lungs. My entire body went numb. The date of the final withdrawal was exactly 12 years ago. It was not just the year that sent a paralyzing shockwave through my system. It was the exact month. It was the exact week. I backed away from the desk, my hands trembling. The memory of that week hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the same week my mother had burst into my bedroom screaming that a velvet pouch of her antique diamond jewelry was missing. It was the same week my father had cornered me in the kitchen, emptying my backpack and demanding I confess to stealing from them. It was the same week they had called the local police to file a formal report accusing me of grand larceny, ensuring I was too terrified to stay in the house. It was the exact same week they threw me out into the pouring rain with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back, forcing me to live in my car. I stood in the center of the office, the pieces of a horrifying puzzle rapidly snapping together in my mind. They did not kick me out because they thought I stole jewelry. They kicked me out to ensure I would run away and never discover the massive theft they were committing against me in that very moment. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was staggering. It was not just cruel parenting. It was a highly calculated, malicious financial crime. Felix stood up from his chair, watching my face drain of color. "Camille," he asked softly, stepping toward me, "what happened 12 years ago?" I looked at him, my eyes burning with a sudden, devastating clarity. 12 years ago, I whispered, my voice thick with absolute realization. My parents threw me away, and now I know exactly why. I need you to pull the original bank records, Felix. I need the actual signature documents for those wire transfers, right now. Felix did not ask any more questions. He spun his chair back around to face his monitors and began typing with a frantic, intense speed. I stood behind him, watching lines of code and secure portal requests flash across the dark screen. The federal background check had provided the routing numbers and the institution name, but accessing the original digitized signature cards from over a decade ago required bypassing standard commercial firewalls. Felix used a specialized legal discovery software our attorney had provided for the injunction preparation. The minutes dragged on. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, trying to physically hold myself together. My mind reeled backward, replaying the cold threats of my parents from that rainy night 12 years ago when they called me a thief. They had threatened to have me thrown in jail. I had spent months sleeping in parking lots, jumping at every siren, convinced I was a fugitive. and all the while they were the ones committing the crime. A soft ping from the computer yanked me out of my memories. Got it! Felix announced, his voice tight with anticipation. The bank digitized their paper records 7 years ago. I am pulling the original wire transfer authorization forms now. A scanned image of a faded banking document loaded onto the primary monitor. I leaned in, closed my eyes, scanning the heavily redacted lines until I found the authorization section at the bottom of the page. There on the designated line was my name, Camille Ethel. But it was not my handwriting. It was an exact replica of my mother's distinct cursive script. Beatrice had forged my signature to authorize the liquidation of $250,000. I felt a wave of absolute nausea wash over me. Pull up the destination accounts, I instructed, keeping my voice as steady as possible. I need to see exactly where my grandfather's money went. Felix clicked through to the next page of the ledger. The transfer destinations were glaringly obvious. The funds had not been dispersed into a generic joint family account. They had been funneled directly into 3 separate holding accounts. One was tied to a boutique clothing business Brittany launched at 19, which spectacularly failed less than 6 months later. Another transfer went straight to a luxury travel agency, covering the cost of an extended European vacation my parents and Brittany took that same summer, a trip they claimed they had saved for years to afford. The final and largest sum was deposited into a private trust, established solely in Brittany's name, ensuring her lavish lifestyle and complete financial security throughout her 20s. They stole my inheritance to fund her golden child existence. They drained the only gift my grandfather left me so Brittany could play dress-up and pretend to be a successful entrepreneur. They knew I would eventually receive notification from the bank about the trust turning over to my control when I hit 22. They needed me gone before that happened. They needed me completely isolated, terrified of the authorities, and cut off from any legal resources. The missing jewelry and the immediate eviction were just carefully orchestrated theatrical performances to cover a massive financial theft. Felix sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He looked at the forged signature on the screen and then up at me. "Camille, this is not just terrible parenting," he said, his tone hushed. "This is wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. By crossing state lines, it becomes a federal felony. There is no statute of limitations on this financial fraud because you were kept unaware of the crime through deliberate intimidation. If we hand these documents over to the district attorney, your parents will face severe prison time." I stared at the screen, feeling a strange, terrifying calm settle over my entire body. The lingering childhood desire to finally make them proud evaporated, completely replaced by a cold, unbreakable armor. They had tried to destroy my business day to protect Brittany. They had tried to destroy my life 12 years ago to enrich her. I was done playing defense. "Print 3 copies of everything," I commanded, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "Put the original digital files on a secure encrypted flash drive. Send 1 copy of the packet directly to our lawyer to clear our background check for the municipal injunction tomorrow. I need to know exactly how long it will take to prepare a second packet for me to take with me tonight." Felix hit the print command. "I will have it collated in 10 minutes, he promised. "Where are you taking the second packet tonight?" I looked at the pages sliding out of the printer tray, the undeniable proof of my parents' federal crimes. "I am taking it to the one man who needs to know exactly what kind of criminals his son is marrying into," I replied. "I am going to see Harrison Thornton." I did not bother changing my clothes. I drove straight from my field office to the sprawling gated estate of the Thornton family. The drive took 40 minutes, but my mind was entirely focused. When I reached the towering iron gates, I pressed the intercom button and provided my name to the security detail. The gates swung open immediately, and a guard directed me to pull up to the main entrance of the imposing stone mansion. Harrison was waiting for me in his private study lined with dark wood shelves. He stood up from his massive desk as I entered, his expression shifting to one of deep concern when he saw the cold intensity radiating from my posture. "Camille," he said, stepping forward. "My security team said you insisted on seeing me immediately. What has happened? Has your family done something else?" I did not waste time with pleasantries. I walked directly to his desk and dropped the thick manila folder onto the polished mahogany surface. I told you that my parents kicked me out of the house 12 years ago. I began, my voice remarkably steady. I told you they filed a false police report claiming I stole from them, forcing me to hide in my car the night I saved Leo. But I did not know the real reason they did it until an hour ago. Harrison looked down at the folder and then back up at my face. He slowly reached out and opened the cover. What am I looking at, Camille? You are looking at federal wire fraud, I stated plainly. You are looking at undeniable proof of embezzlement and identity theft. 12 years ago, my parents forged my signature to drain a $250,000 trust fund left to me by my late grandfather. They funneled every single penny into accounts controlled by Brittany. They bought her a failed business, a European vacation, and established a private trust. They fabricated the story about me stealing jewelry so I would run away and never discover that they were the actual thieves. Harrison fell silent, carefully turning the pages, examining the digital signature cards and the bank routing numbers. I watched his jaw tighten as his legendary temper began to boil just beneath the surface. He was a powerful man who built an empire on trust and ruthless business acumen. The idea of fraud disgusted him on a fundamental level. To see it perpetrated against the woman who saved his child was enough to push him over the edge. "These are federal crimes," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Your parents are felons. Brittany is entirely funded by stolen money." He closed the folder and looked at me, his eyes burning with a dark protective fury. "Spencer is engaged to a woman whose entire existence is subsidized by a crime committed against you. They are attempting to merge their fraudulent family into my legacy. My father even tried to use your family name today to illegally sabotage a massive municipal contract for my firm," I added, ensuring he had the complete picture of their audacity. "He threatened a local historical society, claiming Spencer would pull Thornton funding if they did not drop my company." Harrison let out a sharp breath, his hands balling into fists. The sheer arrogance of these people is staggering. They think they can manipulate my name while actively trying to destroy the woman who saved my son. He paced toward the large window. When he turned back to face me, a plan was already forming in his eyes. "I promised you a silent alliance, Camille," he stated, his tone ringing with lethal intent. "I promised we would test their greed and expose their true nature. We are going beyond a test now. We are going to build a trap so massive they will never be able to climb out of it. We are going to let them believe they have won everything right up until the moment we take it all away." He walked back to his desk and pulled a thick leather-bound portfolio from the top drawer. He opened it to reveal glossy architectural renderings of a sprawling stone estate. "This is Thornton Manor," he said, gesturing to the images. "It is the original property my grandfather built when he first established our company. It sits on 300 acres of prime real estate just outside the city limits. The manor has been sitting empty for the past decade because it requires a massive, historically accurate restoration. I have been vetting commercial contractors for 6 months, but none of them possess the finesse required to preserve the original woodwork and masonry. I was prepared to delay the project indefinitely. But looking at you right now, I know exactly who is going to restore my family legacy." I looked at the renderings, my professional instincts immediately taking over. The estate was a masterpiece of 19th-century architecture. It featured Gothic archways, intricate stained glass windows, and massive wraparound stone terraces. It was the kind of project restoration architects dreamed of landing. "A project of this magnitude would cost at least $50 million," I noted, running my hand over the detailed schematics. "It would require a team of specialized artisans and months of meticulous labor." Harrison nodded, his expression deadly serious. "I will authorize a $50 million budget tomorrow morning," he stated. "But we are going to structure the contract very carefully. Your firm operates under the name Ethel Restoration, but your corporate umbrella is an LLC. What is the exact legal name of your holding company?" "Ethel Holding Group," I replied. "My name is completely buried in the corporate registration paperwork. We structured it that way to protect our personal assets when we first started taking on high-liability commercial jobs. Unless someone runs a federal audit or subpoenas our tax records, they will only see the name of our legal registered agent." "Perfect," Harrison said, a sharp smile breaking through his anger. "I am going to award the Thornton Manor restoration contract to Ethel Holding Group. I will instruct my executive team to handle the initial paperwork through your legal agent. To the outside world, including your parents and my future daughter-in-law, the Thornton family is simply hiring an elite, faceless corporate entity to renovate our historic estate. They will have absolutely no idea that you are the lead architect and chief executive officer running the entire operation. I stared at him, realizing the sheer brilliance of the setup. You want to give them enough rope to hang themselves, I said softly. Harrison closed the leather portfolio and rested his hands flat on top of it. Spencer and Brittany are planning to host their post-wedding gala at the manor, he explained. It is supposed to be the grand unveiling of the restored property. Brittany is already acting as if she owns the estate. She has been begging me to let her oversee the renovation contractors. She claims she has an impeccable eye for design and wants to ensure the manor is perfectly suited for her grand entrance into high society. I am going to give her exactly what she wants. I am going to put her in direct contact with the project manager of Ethel Holding Group. The poetic justice of the trap was breathtaking. My sister, who believed I was nothing but a pathetic floor cleaner, who owed her $15,000 for floral arrangements, was about to be handed over to me on a silver platter. She would be communicating her demands to a nameless project manager, never realizing she was issuing orders to the very sister she had spent her entire life trying to destroy. She will try to exploit the project, I warned him. Brittany has no respect for history or boundaries. If you give her authority over the contractors, she will abuse it. That is exactly what I am counting on, Harrison replied, his voice hard as steel. I want to see how she treats people she views as the hired help. I want to see what she demands when she thinks she has unrestricted access to Thornton money. I want you to document every single interaction you have with her, Camille. Save every email, record every phone call, log every change order she tries to push through. When the rehearsal dinner arrives, we will lay all of her behavior out for the entire world to see. And then you will present the felony fraud documents to your parents in front of my entire board of directors. I left the Thornton estate that night with a signed letter of intent for a $50 million contract and a clear path to absolute justice. The drive back to my apartment felt entirely different from the frantic journey earlier that evening. My parents had tried to use the Thornton name to illegally sabotage my municipal contract and starve my business. In response, the patriarch of the Thornton family had personally handed me the weapon I needed to tear their false empire down to the studs. The next morning, I walked into my field office with a renewed sense of energy. Felix was already at his desk reviewing the legal injunction paperwork our lawyer had prepared for the Historical Society Board. He looked up as I closed the door behind me. "How did the meeting with Harrison Thornton go?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Did he believe the documents?" I walked over to his desk and placed the signed letter of intent down in front of him. He believed every single word I said. Cancel the injunction against the municipal board, Felix. We do not need the Heritage Library contract anymore. Felix frowned, looking down at the heavy cream cardstock bearing the embossed Thornton family crest. He picked it up and read the brief legal text. His jaw dropped as his eyes scanned the $50 million budget allocation. "Camille," he breathed, looking up at me in absolute shock. "This is the Thornton Manor restoration. This is the biggest private preservation contract in the state. How did you pull this off?" I pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. I explained the entire conversation with Harrison, including the revelation about the burning car 12 years ago and the secret alliance we had formed on the terrace. Felix listened in stunned silence as the full picture of the trap came into view. I was a brilliant operational manager, and he instantly understood the mechanical beauty of what Harrison was proposing. "They are going to hand themselves over on a silver platter," Felix said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Your sister is going to think she is bossing around some nameless corporate drone. She will have no idea she is handing you a documented trail of her own greed." We spent the rest of the week mobilizing our top-tier preservation teams. We set up a secure, dedicated email server under the Ethel Holding Group domain, specifically for all correspondence regarding the Thornton Manor project. I assigned myself the generic title of Lead Project Coordinator, ensuring my actual name never appeared on any of the preliminary communications. We signed strict non-disclosure agreements with our foremen and site managers, instructing them to never refer to me by name if the client visited the property. The stage was perfectly set. On Friday afternoon, the first email arrived in our newly established inbox. It was sent from Brittany's personal account, flagged with high importance. Felix called me over, pointing at the screen. "Here we go," he said, clicking open the message. I read the text over his shoulder, feeling cold anticipation. Brittany had not wasted a single moment establishing her dominance. To the project manager of Ethel Holding Group, her email began. "I am the future Mrs. Spencer Thornton. Harrison Thornton has allowed me to oversee the restoration of my new home. I expect immediate compliance with my design directives. Do not proceed with interior work until I approve the aesthetic. I will not tolerate pushback from your construction staff." I smiled, a slow, dangerous smile settling across my features. The golden child had confidently stepped into our massive trap. I drafted a reply, carefully selecting my words to project the image of a deferential low-level manager. "Dear Ms. Thornton-to-be," I typed, relishing the irony. "Ethel Holding Group is honored to handle the restoration of Thornton Manor. We look forward to executing your vision within the parameters of historical preservation guidelines. Please forward your initial design directives at your earliest convenience." I hit send, and within 15 minutes my inbox pinged. Brittany had replied, attaching a massive PDF file titled "Thornton Manor: The New Era." Felix and I opened the document, our eyes widening as we scrolled through page after page of absolute architectural desecration. She wasn't proposing a restoration. She was demanding a complete, tasteless demolition of a protected heritage site. Her first demand targeted the grand foyer. The original 1890s hand-carved mahogany grand staircase, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that was specifically protected under state historical registry laws, was marked for removal. In its place, she wanted a floating glass staircase with LED underlighting. "She wants to tear out the mahogany," Felix asked, his voice a mix of horror and disbelief. "That staircase alone is worth $1 million and is legally protected by the Historical Society. If we touch it without a federal variance, the firm faces massive fines and criminal charges." I nodded, my eyes scanning the next page. "It gets worse. Look at the library." The Thornton Manor Library housed floor-to-ceiling original oak paneling and a priceless fresco painted on the vaulted ceiling. Brittany's directive ordered the oak paneling to be painted stark white and the fresco to be plastered over to accommodate modern recessed track lighting. Furthermore, she demanded that the original cast-iron antique chandeliers be ripped down and replaced with imported gaudy gold-plated fixtures she had found in a luxury catalog. "This is insane," Felix muttered, leaning closer to the monitor. "She is demanding we commit federal preservation violations on nearly every page. She wants to turn a 19th-century masterpiece into a tacky, oversized nightclub." I leaned back in my chair, a cold, calculating calm settling over me. "Draft a formal response, Felix. Use standard industry language. Inform her that her requested alterations violate the Historical Preservation Act of 1966. Explain that removing the mahogany staircase and plastering over the fresco will result in immediate loss of the property's historical tax credits and invite federal prosecution." Felix nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he drafted the response, ensuring every legal consequence was clearly outlined. We hit send, expecting a retreat or at least a negotiation. We drastically underestimated the depths of Brittany's entitlement. Her response arrived less than an hour later, the tone dripping with arrogant aggression. To the project manager, her email read, "I am not interested in your bureaucratic excuses or your outdated historical regulations. I am the one marrying into this family, and this manor will reflect my modern aesthetic, not some dusty history book. I expect the mahogany staircase removed by Friday. If you refuse to comply with my design directives, I will personally speak with Harrison Thornton and have your firm terminated before the end of the week. Do not mistake my directives for suggestions. Comply immediately or consider yourselves fired." I read the email twice, making absolutely sure I had not misunderstood her brazen threat. She had just documented in a legally binding corporate email her direct order for us to break federal preservation laws, accompanied by an explicit threat of termination if we refused to commit the crime. It was a spectacular display of reckless arrogance. "Print that," I told Felix, my voice hard and steady. "Print every single email she sends, save them to the encrypted drive, and forward a copy directly to Harrison's private server. Let him see exactly how his future daughter-in-law intends to treat his family's legacy." Over the next 2 weeks, the situation escalated from absurd to dangerously unhinged. Brittany's demands became more frequent and increasingly illegal. She ordered the demolition of a protected 19th-century greenhouse to make room for an infinity pool. She demanded we tear out the original stained glass windows in the dining hall because the colors clashed with her preferred wedding color palette. Each time we politely informed her of the legal and structural impossibilities of her demands, she responded with escalating threats, repeatedly invoking Spencer's name and Harrison's authority to try and force our hand. "Spencer agrees with me completely," she wrote in one particularly aggressive email after we refused to demolish a protected load-bearing stone wall in the East Wing. "He is appalled by your firm's lack of vision and constant refusal to accommodate my requests. If you cannot handle a simple modernization project, we will find a contractor who can. You work for us, remember that." I carefully archived the email, a chilling realization settling over me. She wasn't acting alone. Spencer Thornton, the heir to the empire, was actively enabling her behavior. He was validating her insane demands and empowering her to threaten the very contractors his father had personally hired. He was proving to be just as superficial, entitled, and reckless as the woman he was preparing to marry. I spent the week meticulously cataloging every piece of correspondence that arrived in the encrypted inbox. Felix set up a dedicated digital vault, ensuring that every timestamp attachment and thinly veiled threat was preserved with forensic precision. We needed to establish a pattern of behavior so undeniable that even the most sympathetic observer would see my sister for exactly what she was. To draw that out, I continued to play the role of the helpless corporate coordinator. I responded to her frantic emails with polite, legally grounded explanations of architectural preservation standards. I cited state registry statutes and federal building codes, knowing exactly how much that would infuriate a woman who was entirely used to bending reality to her will. My calculated resistance worked perfectly. Brittany's messages quickly escalated from entitled demands to outright hostility. She began demanding we source rare materials that violated our firm's strict ethical guidelines. She requested we demolish a massive structural retaining wall simply because she wanted a more open concept flow for the catering staff at her wedding reception. When I politely informed her that removing that specific wall would literally collapse the entire east wing of the manor, her response was a masterclass in sheer delusion. She told me to figure it out, or she would find someone who could, adding that my incompetence was ruining her vision. She treated the preservation of a century-old estate like a trivial home makeover show, completely indifferent to the destruction she was attempting to authorize. I documented every word. But the most revealing moment of the entire operation did not come from my sister. It came 3 days later on a Tuesday morning when a new email appeared in the project inbox. The sender name made my breath catch in my throat. It was Spencer Thornton. Up until that point, I had harbored a tiny, lingering shred of sympathy for the man. I had assumed that Spencer was simply blinded by love, a naive billionaire heir who had fallen for a carefully crafted innocent persona. I thought he was a passive victim of my family's manipulation. That illusion shattered the moment I opened his message. Brittany had looped him into our email chain regarding the protected load-bearing wall. I braced myself, half expecting an apology from him. Instead, I found a message dripping with an arrogance that rivaled my mother's worst days. To the management team at Ethel Holding Group, Spencer wrote, his tone sharp and utterly dismissive. "My fiancé has informed me that your firm is repeatedly refusing to execute her design vision for our property. Let me make something perfectly clear to you. We are not interested in your tedious historical lectures or your obsession with outdated building codes. The manor is our future home, and it will be updated to reflect our modern lifestyle. If Brittany wants a wall removed, your only job is to bring in the demolition crew and make it happen. I am not paying your firm tens of millions of dollars to argue with the woman I am going to marry. Spencer went on to explicitly threaten our contract, completely mirroring Brittany's toxic entitlement. Do not send her any more emails citing federal preservation laws, he demanded. You are contracted laborers, and you serve at our pleasure. If I hear one more complaint from her about your lack of cooperation, I will personally see to it that your firm is terminated, and I will ensure my father blacklists your company from ever securing another commercial contract in this city. Consider this your final warning. Get in line or get out. I stared at the bright computer screen, a cold realization washing over me. Felix stood beside my desk, reading the email in complete silence. He let out a low, incredulous whistle, shaking his head. Spencer Thornton was not a victim. He was a willing, active participant in the madness. He was just as superficial, just as arrogant, and just as deeply flawed as the woman he had chosen to marry. He viewed the magnificent historic Thornton Manor not as a cherished family legacy to be preserved, but as a generic status symbol to be gutted and molded to fit their shallow tastes. He viewed skilled artisans and architectural experts as nothing more than peasant laborers who should blindly follow orders. He was actively enabling her worst impulses, shielding her from the reality of laws and consequences, simply because he believed his immense wealth placed them both entirely above the rules. The perfect heir my parents were so desperate to secure was in reality a spoiled tyrant who operated with the exact same lack of moral compass as my mother and sister. I felt a surge of vindication mingled with profound disgust. I highlighted Spencer's email and dragged it directly into the secured folder we had prepared for Harrison. This changes the entire dynamic of the trap, I told Felix, my voice steady and resolute. We are no longer just exposing my family to a grieving father. We are exposing a father to the bitter truth about his own son. Harrison needs to see exactly who he is handing the keys to his empire over to. Felix agreed, his expression grave. This is going to break the old man's heart, Felix noted quietly. But it is better he knows now before he legally binds his legacy to these people forever. I drafted a highly secure encrypted message to Harrison Thornton, attaching the entire catalog of correspondence. I included the emails where Brittany demanded the destruction of the mahogany staircase, the messages where she threatened to fire us over the dining hall windows, and finally the damning email from Spencer, where he threatened to leverage the Thornton name to blacklist a firm simply for following federal law. I did not add any personal commentary to the message. The evidence was overwhelming and required no embellishment. I simply hit send and waited. Less than 20 minutes later, my direct phone line rang. It was a private number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. I answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so Felix could hear. Camille Harrison said, his voice sounding older and heavier than it had on the country club terrace. The sheer exhaustion in his tone was palpable. Have you reviewed the files I sent? I asked, gently navigating the delicate emotional territory. Yes, he replied, letting out a long, ragged sigh. I have read every single word. I expected the blatant greed from your sister. We prepared for that. But seeing Spencer write those things, seeing him threaten a business with my name to defend her illegal demands, it is a bitter pill to swallow. I am deeply sorry, Mr. Thornton. I offered, feeling a genuine wave of sympathy for the patriarch. It is not an easy thing to discover about your own child. He was quiet for a moment, the heavy silence stretching across the line. Do not be sorry, Harrison finally said, his voice hardening with a sudden returning resolve. You have given me absolute clarity today. You have proven that my son is entirely unfit to manage the Thornton legacy as long as he remains tied to that woman. He has shown his true colors, and I will not allow my empire to be dismantled by a pair of superficial children. Keep the project moving forward on paper. Do whatever you have to do to keep them feeling comfortable and powerful. The rehearsal dinner is approaching rapidly, and I want them to feel absolutely invincible when they walk into that room. We have everything we need. The contrast between the facade they presented to the public and the reality unfolding in our encrypted inbox was staggering. On social media, Beatrice posted daily updates about the wedding of the century, flooding her feed with carefully curated images of Brittany trying on designer gowns and touring luxury catering facilities. She painted a picture of refined, elegant high society, while behind the scenes, her daughter was acting like a deranged tyrant, bullying construction managers and ordering the destruction of priceless art. Beatrice also used her social media platform to launch passive-aggressive attacks on me, continuing the narrative she had spun at the engagement party. She posted a photo of herself and Brittany sipping champagne with the caption, "So blessed to have a daughter who understands the importance of family legacy and true success." While some people choose to clean up the messes of the past, Brittany is building a brilliant future. Proud mother, Thornton wedding. I watched the post gather hundreds of likes from their country club friends, many of whom chimed in with supportive comments, completely oblivious to the felony fraud my parents had committed to fund that very lifestyle. They had no idea that the floor cleaner they were mocking was currently holding the entire Thornton Manor project in her hands, carefully documenting every single threat and illegal demand Brittany made. I forwarded Beatrice's social media post to Harrison, along with the latest batch of Brittany's unhinged emails. Harrison's response was immediate and chillingly brief. "Keep preserving every new message, Camille. Let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly can. The rehearsal dinner is in 3 weeks. We will bury them all." I closed my laptop, the tension in the office thick with anticipation. We had the forged trust fund documents. We had the bank records of their embezzlement. We had weeks of Brittany's documented illegal demands and threats. We had Spencer's complicity. The trap was fully set, primed, and loaded. All that was left was to wait for the golden child and her fraudulent parents to walk blindly into the spotlight they had so desperately craved. Those words echoed in my mind for the next 3 weeks as the clock ticked down to the rehearsal dinner. I did not speak to my parents or my sister during that time. I let the silence stretch, allowing them to bask in their false sense of security. They had successfully sabotaged my municipal contract, or so they thought, and they believed I was currently licking my wounds in defeat. They assumed I had been sufficiently crushed into submission. They could not have been more wrong. The rehearsal dinner was held on a crisp Friday evening at the Grand Monarch Hotel, the most exclusive and historically significant five-star venue in the city. It was a place where old money mingled, and deals that shaped the skyline were made over prime rib and expensive wine. I handed the keys of my car to the valet and smoothed the fabric of my dress, taking a deep and steadying breath. I had chosen my attire for the evening with meticulous care. I was not going to show up looking like the defeated, impoverished floor cleaner my mother desperately wanted me to be. Nor was I going to wear something loud and desperate for attention. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown. It featured a high, elegant neckline and long sleeves draping perfectly across my frame with structural precision. It was completely devoid of sequins, rhinestones, or gaudy embellishments. The luxury was in the cut, the fabric, and the absolute quiet confidence it projected. I paired it with simple diamond stud earrings I had bought to celebrate my first $1 million contract and classic black stilettos. I wore no gloves, leaving my scarred left hand entirely bare and visible. It was my armor, my history, and my badge of honor. I stepped through the gilded revolving doors of the hotel and made my way toward the main ballroom. The sheer scale of the event was staggering for a rehearsal dinner. 200 guests had been invited, a guest list that rivaled most royal weddings. As I approached the entrance to the ballroom, the heavy double doors were propped open, spilling warm golden light and the soft sounds of a live string quartet into the hallway. The scent of gardenias and expensive champagne washed over me. I knew instantly that Brittany had dictated the floral arrangements, likely threatening several vendors to achieve the overwhelming and suffocating displays that covered every available surface. I paused at the threshold, my eyes scanning the massive room. It was a sea of the city's elite. Politicians, real estate developers, and corporate titans mingled in groups, holding crystal flutes and laughing politely. And holding court at the absolute center of the room was my family. Beatrice was wearing an incredibly loud magenta evening gown that aggressively demanded the attention of everyone around her. She was currently laughing at something a Thornton executive had said, her hand resting performatively on Gerald's arm. Gerald was wearing a tuxedo that looked just a fraction too tight, nodding along as he tried to project the image of a seasoned patriarch. But it was Brittany who truly commanded the spectacle. Despite this only being the rehearsal dinner, my sister had chosen to wear a dress that looked like a tragic collision between a bridal gown and a beauty pageant costume. It was a blindingly bright silver confection, dripping with heavy rhinestones, excessive layers of tulle, and an unnecessarily long train that required guests to physically step out of her way as she moved. It was the desperate, insecure choice of a woman trying to scream her wealth and status to a room full of people who already had both. Spencer stood beside her looking polished and handsome, completely oblivious to the hollow transactional nature of the woman clutching his arm. I took a slow, measured step into the ballroom. I did not try to hide or stick to the shadows. I walked smoothly and purposefully toward one of the cocktail tables near the edge of the dance floor. It only took about 40 seconds for my mother's predatory radar to detect my presence. I saw the exact moment Beatrice noticed me. She had been taking a sip of her champagne, her eyes casually darting across the room to ensure everyone was properly admiring her family. When her gaze landed on my midnight blue dress, she froze. The crystal flute stopped halfway to her mouth. I watched the color rapidly drain from her face, replaced almost instantly by a flush of absolute unadulterated fury. She lowered her glass, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the stem. She aggressively tapped Gerald on the shoulder, leaning in to whisper rapidly in his ear without taking her eyes off me. Gerald turned his head, following her line of sight. His polite, manufactured smile completely collapsed. He stared at me with open hostility, his posture stiffening as if preparing for a physical fight. It did not take long for Brittany to notice her parents' sudden shift in demeanor. She followed their gaze, and when she saw me standing there looking perfectly calm and entirely unbothered, her jaw actually dropped. Even from across the massive ballroom, I could feel the heat of their collective glare. They began to whisper furiously among themselves, a tight, frantic huddle of panic and outrage. I could practically hear the venom in their voices. They were entirely horrified by my audacity to show up. In their minds, I had been utterly defeated. I had been fired from my municipal contract. I had refused to pay their floral bill, and I had been permanently banished from their social sphere. To them, my presence at this five-star hotel was a brazen, unforgivable insult. It was a direct challenge to their carefully constructed narrative of perfection. I simply held their gaze. I did not flinch, I did not look down, and I did not offer a polite smile. I stared back at them with the cold, immovable certainty of a woman who held the match to their entire house of cards. I reached out and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, my scarred left hand turning upward in the warm chandelier light. The whispers began to spread outward from their immediate circle. Beatrice began leaning into the ears of her country club friends, undoubtedly spinning a frantic last-minute lie about why her estranged, disappointing daughter had crashed the exclusive event. She was likely painting me as a desperate, unhinged floor cleaner, trying to beg for a handout from the wealthy groom. I watched guests cast sideways, judgmental glances in my direction, their eyes raking over my dress, searching for a flaw or a sign of the poverty my mother had promised them I lived in. They found nothing but immaculate tailoring and steady, unshakable composure. Through the crowd of murmuring guests and hostile glares, my eyes found the head table situated at the front of the room. Harrison Thornton was seated there, quietly observing the entire dynamic. He saw my parents' frantic whispering. He saw the guests turning to judge me, and he saw me standing there absorbing it all without breaking a sweat. Harrison caught my eye across the vast expanse of the ballroom. His face remained perfectly impassive, revealing absolutely nothing to the people surrounding him. But for a brief, almost imperceptible second, he gave me a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent acknowledgement between partners. The pieces were all exactly where we needed them to be. The golden child and the fraudulent parents were comfortably seated at the absolute pinnacle of their false success, surrounded by the elite society they had sacrificed me to join. The catering staff began to chime the delicate dinner bells, signaling the guests to take their assigned seats for the multi-course meal. The ambient chatter shifted as 200 people began moving toward the intricately decorated tables. I found my place card at a small table situated far in the back corner of the room, exactly where my mother would have banished me to ensure I remained unseen and unheard. It was the perfect vantage point. I sat down smoothly, placing my small clutch on the table. The tension in the air was thick and electric, a heavy suffocating pressure building right beneath the surface of the polite piano music and clinking silverware. They thought they had won. They thought this dinner was the coronation of their social climbing victory. They had no idea that the executioner was already sitting comfortably in the room. The first course arrived with the synchronized precision that only a five-star hotel staff could execute. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved seamlessly between the tables, placing plates of seared scallops and delicate microgreens in front of the guests. I took a small bite of my appetizer, focusing on the complex flavors to ground myself in the present moment. The conversation around my secluded table was muted. I was seated with a few distant relatives of the Thornton family and some mid-level corporate executives who clearly did not know what to make of the solitary woman in the midnight blue dress. They exchanged polite pleasantries about the weather and the beautiful floral centerpieces, but the undercurrent of my mother's whispered smear campaign had clearly reached them. They avoided direct eye contact with me, opting instead to cast furtive glances whenever they thought I was not looking. I ignored their discomfort and directed my attention to the head table. Beatrice was in her element. She was holding court, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to a captive audience of Spencer's affluent relatives. Brittany sat beside her, glowing under the attention, her massive diamond engagement ring catching the light every time she reached for her wine glass, looking perfectly invincible. As the main course was cleared away and the dessert plates were set down, the sharp sound of a silver spoon tapping against crystal rang out through the ballroom. The ambient chatter gradually faded into a respectful silence. Beatrice stood up, her magenta gown rustling loudly. She smoothed her hair and stepped gracefully toward the standing microphone positioned near the center of the head table. A spotlight shifted to illuminate her across the vast room. She smiled warmly, gazing out at the sea of wealthy faces. "And thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this beautiful union." Beatrice began, her voice echoing softly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "It fills my heart with such profound joy to look around this room and see so many dear friends, family members, and esteemed colleagues. We are gathered to witness the merging of two wonderful families, and I want to personally thank Harrison Thornton for hosting such a magnificent evening." She bowed her head slightly in Harrison's direction, a gesture of calculated deference. Harrison acknowledged her with a blank nod. Beatrice turned her glowing attention to the couple. "When I look at Spencer, I see the exact kind of brilliant, upstanding man I always prayed my daughter would find. He is kind, he is driven, and he understands the fundamental importance of family legacy. But of course it takes an equally remarkable woman to stand beside a man of his caliber." Beatrice placed a hand over her heart, her expression shifting into one of manufactured maternal emotion. "Brittany has always been the light of our family. From the moment she was born, she possessed an extraordinary spirit. She is passionate, she is fiercely intelligent, and she has an impeccable eye for beauty and design. We have watched her pour her heart into everything she does, always striving for absolute perfection. She is a visionary in her own right." I listened to this blatant rewriting of history with a detached sense of awe. Beatrice was describing a woman who did not exist. The real Brittany was a failed entrepreneur who drained a stolen trust fund, threw tantrums when she was denied luxury items, and sent unhinged threats to construction workers. But to this room full of high society elites, Beatrice was selling the image of a refined, capable heiress. Brittany lowered her eyes in a display of practiced modesty, reaching out to squeeze Spencer's hand. Beatrice took a slow breath, letting the silence build before continuing. "Raising children is the greatest privilege a mother can have," she said, her tone taking on a sudden theatrical weight. "But it is also a journey filled with profound challenges and stark contrasts. As parents, we do our best to guide our children toward the light, toward success and grace. But we cannot control the paths they ultimately choose to walk." I felt the atmosphere in the ballroom shift. The guests sensed the change in her tone, leaning in slightly. Beatrice let her gaze drift across the room, passing over the sea of tables, until her eyes landed squarely on me sitting in my quiet corner. The spotlight did not reach my table, but the sudden weight of her focused attention drew the eyes of dozens of guests in my direction. Beatrice offered a sad maternal smile that was laced with pure toxic venom. "We all have to carry our burdens," she stated, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "And while some of our children clean up the messes, Brittany is destined to rule the manor." The words struck exactly as she intended. It was a vicious public shot wrapped in the velvet glove of a wedding toast. She had managed to publicly declare my supposed occupation as a lowly cleaner, while simultaneously elevating Brittany to the status of royalty. The contrast was brutal and intentional. She was telling the entire Thornton social circle that I was the embarrassing mistake of the family, the burden they had to carry, while Brittany was the true prize. A ripple of reaction moved through the ballroom. It was not a loud response, but a collective murmur of realization. The polite, pitying chuckles of the elite crowd bubbled up from the tables surrounding me. Guests exchanged knowing glances, shaking their heads in quiet sympathy for the poor mother who had to endure such a disappointing daughter. The people sitting at my own table looked down at their dessert plates, suddenly deeply fascinated by their chocolate tarts, desperate to avoid association with the woman who had just been publicly humiliated. Brittany beamed from the head table, soaking in the validation. Gerald raised his whiskey glass in a silent toast to his wife's masterful execution. Beatrice held the microphone for a moment longer, letting the polite chuckles fade, letting the sheer weight of my public ruin settle over the room before returning to her seat to a round of warm applause. I did not lower my head. I did not shrink back into my chair or let a single tear touch my eyes. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I felt the burning sting of the insult, but I let it wash right over me. I absorbed the blow with the absolute certainty of a woman who knew the game was already over. Beatrice clearly thought she had just delivered the final crushing strike. She thought she had cemented my place as the pathetic floor cleaner and secured Brittany's throne at Thornton Manor forever. I took a slow, even breath, looking past the smirking faces of my family and focusing directly on Harrison Thornton at the head table. The trap was now fully primed. They had climbed to the highest possible peak of their arrogance, and there was nowhere left for them to go but straight down. I leaned back in my chair and waited patiently for the spectacular reality check that was rapidly approaching. The applause from my mother gradually died down, replaced by the soft clinking of silverware as guests returned to their desserts. Beatrice took her seat, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. She reached over to pat Brittany on the hand, the two of them sharing a conspiratorial, victorious smile. They thought the performance was over. They thought they had perfectly scripted the entire evening. But the silence that followed was abruptly broken by the scraping of a heavy wooden chair against the marble floor. At the center of the head table, Harrison Thornton stood up. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who owned the entire building and everyone inside it. He buttoned his suit jacket, his expression completely unreadable, and walked toward the microphone my mother had just vacated. The ambient noise in the massive ballroom evaporated instantly. When a billionaire patriarch stood to speak at his son's rehearsal dinner, people paid absolute attention. Waiters froze in their tracks, holding trays of champagne, perfectly still, so the clinking glasses would not disturb the quiet. The string quartet in the corner lowered their bows. Harrison reached the microphone and adjusted it downward just a fraction. He looked out over the sea of 200 wealthy guests, his piercing gaze sweeping from the front row all the way to the back corner where I sat. He did not smile. He simply commanded the space with a gravitational pull that sucked all the air out of the room. "Good evening," he began, his deep, resonant voice echoing flawlessly through the speakers. "I want to thank Beatrice for her passionate toast. It is always revealing to hear a mother speak so openly about her children." Beatrice beamed from her seat, fluffing the skirt of her magenta gown, clearly believing that Harrison was validating her cruel spectacle. She leaned closer to Gerald, whispering something I could not hear, completely oblivious to the lethal undertone in Harrison's voice. "Beatrice mentioned something very important in her speech." He continued, his tone carrying a sudden sharp edge. She mentioned Thornton Manor. She mentioned the burdens we carry and the messes that need to be cleaned up. Those words struck a particular chord with me tonight. Thornton Manor is not just a building, it is the absolute cornerstone of my family's legacy. My grandfather built that estate with his own bare hands, laying the foundation for everything the Thornton name represents today. It is a symbol of hard work, integrity, and uncompromising excellence. For the past 10 years, that magnificent estate has sat completely empty. It fell into disrepair because we simply could not find anyone capable of restoring it to its former glory. We interviewed dozens of commercial contractors, but every single one of them lacked the vision and the respect required to handle such a monumental piece of history. They wanted to tear out the soul of the building and replace it with cheap modern imitations. They wanted to destroy the legacy for a quick profit. Brittany shifted slightly in her seat, her heavily rhinestoned dress catching the light. A tiny crease formed between her eyebrows. She had spent the last 3 weeks demanding exactly the kind of cheap modern destruction Harrison was currently condemning. I watched her glance nervously at Spencer, but Spencer was staring straight ahead, completely oblivious to the trap closing around them. We realized that preserving true greatness requires a master, Harrison said, his voice steadily rising in volume and intensity. It requires someone who understands that true value is not found in flashy, superficial displays. True value is built through painstaking, meticulous labor. It requires someone who is not afraid to get their hands dirty to protect what is genuinely important. And so 6 weeks ago, I personally authorized a $50 million budget to completely restore Thornton Manor. The number caused a massive ripple of shocked whispers to roll through the ballroom. $50 million was a staggering sum, even for the wealthy elite gathered in the room. Beatrice and Gerald looked at each other with wide, greedy eyes. They thought Harrison was simply bragging about the lavish lifestyle he was providing for his son and their golden child. I found the perfect firm to handle this monumental undertaking. Harrison continued, letting the whispers fade before speaking again. A firm that operates with absolute uncompromising integrity. For the past month, they have been working tirelessly behind the scenes, preparing the architectural schematics and securing the historical variances necessary to bring the manor back to life. They have faced significant challenges, including unreasonable demands and gross attempts at sabotage, yet they have maintained their absolute professionalism every single step of the way. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, my eyes locked on Harrison. The guests were leaning in, captivated by the unexpected intensity of his speech. This was not a standard rehearsal dinner toast. It was a corporate address, a declaration of power, and an impending execution. I want to take a moment tonight to formally recognize the brilliance behind this $50 million restoration. Harrison announced, his gaze shifting directly from the crowd to the back corner of the room where I sat. Because the chief executive officer of this incredible firm happens to be sitting in this very room with us tonight. A collective murmur of excitement washed over the guests. People began craning their necks, looking around the ballroom to see which prominent real estate developer or famous architect Harrison was about to honor. Beatrice and Gerald looked around eagerly, totally eager to applaud whoever this powerful CEO was so they could attempt to network with them later. Brittany sat up perfectly straight, fluffing her hair, preparing to look gracious and regal for the cameras when the applause started. Beatrice said that some children are destined to rule the manor, while others are left to clean up the messes, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal timbre. But she was profoundly mistaken about who holds the power in this dynamic. The person leading the Ethel Holding Group, the brilliant architect and chief executive officer who holds the entire $50 million Thornton Manor contract in her hands, is none other than Camille. The silence that slammed into the ballroom was absolute and deafening. It was a heavy physical force that crushed the breath out of every single person seated at the tables. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire 200-guest party sat entirely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the statement. At the head table, the reaction was catastrophic. Beatrice's jaw dropped open so far she looked unhinged. All the color drained from her face in a violent rush, leaving her skin a sickly, chalky white. She stared at Harrison, as if he had just spoken in tongues, her mind completely unable to process the words he had just projected across the room. Gerald dropped his whiskey glass. It hit the table with a sharp clatter, spilling amber liquid across the pristine white linen tablecloth. I did not even notice the spill. He was staring blindly out into the crowd, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated panic. Brittany looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Her smug, victorious smile completely disintegrated. She gripped the edges of the table, her knuckles turning bone white, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words that refused to come. She had spent the last 3 weeks screaming at the nameless project manager of Ethel Holding Group, threatening to have them fired, demanding they destroy protected historical property. The realization that she had been sending those unhinged illegal threats directly to the older sister she had spent her entire life mocking hit her with the force of a freight train. I placed my water glass down on the table and pushed my chair back. I stood up slowly, smoothing the midnight blue silk of my designer gown. I did not look at my family. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders back, and my chin held high. I looked directly at Harrison Thornton. At a table near the front of the room, a group of Thornton corporate executives who were fully aware of my identity and the architectural firm I ran stood up. They began to clap. The polite, respectful applause echoed sharply through the stunned silence of the ballroom. A few other guests, entirely confused but following the lead of the corporate executives, joined in. The applause rippled across the room, a surreal soundtrack to the absolute destruction of my family's fabricated reality. I offered a slight gracious nod to Harrison, acknowledging the introduction. I remained standing, a silent, immovable testament to my own hard-won success. Beatrice was practically hyperventilating at the head table. She was gripping the tablecloth, her eyes darting wildly between me and Harrison. Her entire high society narrative, the carefully constructed lie, she had literally just broadcast to the entire city. Elite had been publicly incinerated in less than 3 minutes. She had called me a floor cleaner, and a billionaire had immediately corrected her, crowning me a $50 million chief executive officer. The humiliation was absolute, staggering, and entirely of her own making. The trap had sprung, and the jaws had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. Harrison did not lower the microphone. He waited for the polite applause to naturally fade away before he spoke again. As I mentioned, Harrison's voice resonated through the silent room. The restoration of a historical legacy requires profound respect. It requires individuals who value history over shallow, fleeting vanity. Unfortunately, it became abundantly clear over the past few weeks that not everyone entering our family shares those core values. He gestured toward the back of the room. At his signal, the ambient lights dimmed slightly. 2 massive projection screens, normally reserved for displaying tasteful photo montages of the happy couple, descended smoothly from the ceiling on either side of the head table. Beatrice shrank back into her chair, her eyes darting frantically to the blank screens. Brittany grabbed Spencer's arm, but he pulled away, sensing the impending disaster. The projectors flickered to life. The screens illuminated the dark ballroom with high-definition clarity, displaying the encrypted corporate inbox of Ethel Holding Group. "When you hand someone perceived power," Harrison said, his tone turning clinical and detached, "they will inevitably show you exactly who they are." The first email appeared on the screen in massive, unmissable text. It was Brittany's initial directive, complete with her personal email address and signature. The guests began to read the contents. Gasps rippled through the elite crowd as they processed her demands to rip out the protected hand-carved mahogany grand staircase and replace it with a completely floating glass monstrosity. "As you can see," Harrison narrated, "my future daughter-in-law believes that federal preservation laws are simply bureaucratic excuses. She demanded the destruction of priceless, legally protected historical artifacts because they clashed with her modern aesthetic." The screen shifted to the next email, displaying her aggressive order to plaster over the vaulted ceiling frescoes to make room for gaudy gold-plated catalog fixtures. The wealthy architectural purists in the room let out audible groans of absolute disgust. The public humiliation was surgical and relentless. Harrison clicked to the next slide, revealing the most damning correspondence of all. It was the email where Brittany threatened the contractors, explicitly stating that she was marrying into the family and demanding they obey her or face termination. The text glowed brightly on the dual screens, exposing her pure, unadulterated gold-digging behavior for Spencer's entire family to witness. She treated elite historical artisans like peasant laborers, Harrison stated, his voice ringing with disgust. She threatened to weaponize my family's name and our financial influence to force a construction firm to commit federal crimes, just so she could turn my grandfather's estate into a tacky status symbol. Brittany scrambled out of her chair. "That is a lie," she shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically. "Those are fake. Camille fabricated those to ruin me." Harrison did not even look at her. "The digital forensic timestamps are verified," he stated flatly, "and they perfectly match the Internet Protocol addresses from your personal devices. You cannot lie your way out of this." Spencer stared at the screens, his face burning with a dark, humiliated red flush. He was realizing that the woman he planned to marry was not just an embarrassment, but a severe legal and social liability. The elite guests whispered furiously, pointing at the screen, and then looking at Brittany with naked contempt. Beatrice tried to reach out to comfort her golden child, but Brittany slapped her mother's hand away, completely unspooling in the center of the ballroom. The carefully curated illusion of the refined, sophisticated bride was entirely demolished, replaced by the ugly reality of a greedy, superficial tyrant. Harrison let the final email sit on the screen for a full 30 seconds, ensuring every single guest had ample time to absorb the absolute toxicity of her words. Then the screens went completely black. The ballroom lights slowly returned to their normal warm glow. Harrison turned his attention away from the panicked, hyperventilating bride and focused his piercing gaze back on me. "But this evening is not just about exposing the terrible flaws in our judgment," Harrison said, his voice softening, just a fraction taking on a deeply personal emotional weight. "It is about correcting a 12-year-old injustice. It is about honoring true, unquestionable character." He looked toward the side of the room. "Leo, please come up here." A young man in a sharp black suit stepped out from the shadows near the entrance. I was 26 years old now, tall and broad-shouldered, but as he walked toward the center stage, I could still see the terrified 14-year-old boy I had dragged through the mud. Leo did not look at his brother, and he completely ignored my family. His eyes were locked directly on me, shining with overwhelming gratitude and unspoken emotion. He walked up the short steps and stood proudly beside his father. Harrison placed a heavy, affectionate hand on his youngest son's shoulder. 12 years ago, Harrison began, his voice thick with raw fatherly emotion. My son Leo was involved in a horrific car accident. The vehicle skidded off a rain-slicked road and plunged deep into a ravine. The driver was killed instantly. Leo was trapped in the passenger seat, completely helpless as the engine block caught fire. The flames were spreading into the cabin. He was going to burn alive. The ballroom fell into an absolute, breathless silence. Not a single glass clinked. Even Beatrice and Gerald sat frozen, unsure of where this story was leading, completely unaware of the massive trap that was about to spring shut on their necks. "I was saved by a stranger," Harrison continued, his voice ringing with fierce conviction. "A young woman who ran down the embankment, wrapped her arm in a jacket, and punched through the blazing safety glass. She dragged my son out seconds before the car exploded." Harrison pointed directly at me. "Camille, please hold up your left hand." I raised my left arm, turning my palm outward for the room to see. The thick white scar glowed starkly under the chandeliers. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 guests. They stared at the undeniable physical proof of my sacrifice. "She tore her hand to the bone to save my child," Harrison declared loudly. "Do you know why she fled before the police arrived? Because that same night her parents had thrown her out into the freezing rain. They discarded their daughter like trash to protect their golden child." He turned his full, terrifying wrath onto my parents. "You stood in my presence tonight and called this woman a floor cleaner. You introduced the savior of my family, a self-made chief executive officer, as a disappointment. You threw a hero onto the street, and you spent your lives enabling a superficial parasite instead. You are the absolute shame of this city, and your presence disgusts me." Beatrice clamped a hand over her mouth, letting out a horrified sob. Gerald slumped down in his chair, completely destroyed by the public shaming. The ballroom stared at them with unfiltered revulsion. For a few agonizing heartbeats, the only sound in the massive five-star venue was the ragged, hyperventilating breathing of my mother. Then the dam broke. Complete and utter chaos erupted across the room. 200 high society guests, who were usually bound by strict rules of polite decorum, began talking all at once. The whispers swelled into a loud, chaotic roar of disbelief and outrage. People were pointing directly at my parents. Some guests were already pulling out their phones to text the scandal to anyone not in attendance. The carefully constructed facade of my family was not just cracking, it was shattering into a million irreparable pieces in real time. Gerald realized his entire social and financial existence was evaporating before his very eyes. The public shaming pushed him past the point of rational thought, triggering a desperate, aggressive survival instinct. He scrambled out of his chair, knocking it backward so forcefully it crashed onto the marble floor. He lunged toward the center of the head table, his face a mask of sweating, frantic panic. He grabbed the microphone stand, tearing it away from Harrison with trembling hands. "Do not listen to him!" Gerald shouted into the microphone, his voice booming with a wild, manic edge. "Do not listen to any of this. It is a complete fabrication. She is a liar." He pointed a shaking finger across the room directly at me. "Camille has always been deeply troubled. She is a thief. 12 years ago, she stole priceless antique jewelry from her own mother and ran away in the middle of the night to escape the police. She is a criminal who abandoned her family. She is just trying to extort us because she is jealous of her sister. You cannot believe a single word she says." His desperate lies echoed through the grand ballroom, but they landed on entirely deaf ears. The crowd had just seen the undeniable proof of Brittany's unhinged greed projected onto massive screens, and they had heard a billionaire patriarch confirm my heroics. Gerald was screaming into a void. I did not raise my voice to interrupt his pathetic tantrum. Instead, I reached down to the small cocktail table where I had been sitting and picked up the beautifully bound leather folder I had brought with me. I held it in my right hand, feeling the satisfying weight of 12 years of hidden truth. I stepped out from behind my table and began to walk across the ballroom floor. The chaotic noise in the room began to quiet down as guests noticed my movement. They physically parted to make way for me, creating a wide, clear path straight down the center of the venue. I walked with slow, measured steps, my midnight blue silk gown gliding effortlessly over the marble floor. I did not look angry. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute calm. I was finally delivering the consequences they had evaded for over a decade. I reached the steps of the elevated head table. Gerald stopped shouting as I approached the microphone, lowering in his trembling hands. His frantic energy completely vanished, replaced by a sudden suffocating terror as he looked into my eyes. He saw the cold, immovable certainty staring back at him, and he knew instantly that his pathetic lies were useless. I walked directly up to the table, stopping right in front of where my mother was sobbing into her hands. Gerald backed away, pressing himself against the wall behind the table. I lifted the heavy leather folder and dropped it directly onto the center of the table. It hit the polished mahogany surface with a loud, definitive thud that echoed sharply through the quiet room. It landed right next to Beatrice's plate, upsetting a crystal wine glass that tipped over and spilled red liquid across the white linen. I turned to Gerald and calmly took the microphone from his unresisting grip. He let it go as if it were burning his skin. I adjusted my grip and looked out at the sea of wealthy guests before turning my gaze back to my terrified parents. "You did not kick me out because you thought I stole from you," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the massive ballroom. I did not raise my pitch. The quiet authority in my tone commanded absolute attention. "You kicked me out to ensure I would run away and never discover the massive financial crime you were actively committing against me. You called me a thief tonight to cover up your own federal felonies." I gestured to the leather resting on the table. Inside that folder is a comprehensive forensic financial audit and the original digitized bank records from exactly 12 years ago. It contains the complete documentation of a $250,000 trust fund left strictly to me by my late grandfather. Beatrice let out a sharp, strangled gasp, dropping her hands from her face to stare at the folder in pure, unadulterated horror. Brittany, who was still slumped in her chair, let out a quiet whimper, realizing the money that funded her entire life was poisoned. I kept my voice perfectly level. The documents inside that folder prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you, Beatrice, forged my signature on federal banking forms. You and Gerald illegally drained every single penny of my inheritance. You funneled the stolen money into private accounts to fund Brittany's failed businesses and extravagant vacations. You framed me for stealing family jewelry, so I would be too terrified of the police to ever look into my own financial standing. You sacrificed your own daughter to the streets to finance a golden child who treats everyone around her like garbage. The ballroom erupted into a fresh wave of horrified gasps. The Thornton executives at the front tables looked at my parents with absolute disgust. Spencer took 3 large steps away from Brittany, physically distancing himself from the fraudulent family he had almost married into. Gerald opened his mouth to speak to formulate another lie, but no words came out. His face was a sickly pale gray. You threatened to destroy my company this week, using a fake connection to the Thornton name. I continued staring directly into my father's panicked eyes. You thought I was still a helpless 22-year-old girl you could easily intimidate. But you severely underestimated me. I did not bring those documents here tonight just to embarrass you. I brought them here as a courtesy notification. The original copies of those forged wire transfers and the complete forensic financial audit were submitted to the district attorney this morning. My mother buried her face in her hands and began to loudly weep in absolute total defeat. Gerald slumped back into his chair, completely broken by the horrible truth. You are both going to federal prison for a very long time. I stated, my voice carrying absolute icy certainty across the stunned, silent room as I turned my back and walked slowly away from the head table, leaving them to their well-deserved, extremely public and permanent ruin. The heavy silence of the ballroom broke the moment I turned my back. The collective gasp of 200 affluent guests morphed into a frantic, buzzing hive of scandalized whispers. I walked down the center aisle, my steps measured and unhurried, feeling the oppressive weight of the past 12 years finally lifting off my shoulders. Behind me at the head table, the reality of my declaration was crashing down on Spencer Thornton with the force of an avalanche. He stood frozen, staring at the leather folder resting near my mother's overturned wine glass. The word felony hung in the air, a toxic cloud that threatened to suffocate anyone standing too close. The Thornton name was synonymous with integrity and philanthropic power. Now he was standing next to a woman whose entire existence was funded by federal wire fraud, surrounded by her criminal parents. Spencer looked towards his father. Harrison remained standing, his posture rigid, and his expression utterly unforgiving. He did not offer his son a life raft. Spencer swallowed hard, the flush of humiliation spreading rapidly up his neck. He looked at Brittany. She was reaching out to him with trembling hands, her rhinestone dress glittering mockingly under the chandeliers. Her face was streaked with black mascara, her carefully crafted facade entirely melted away. "Spencer," she whimpered, her voice cracking in a desperate plea. "Spencer, please do not look at me like that. You know I had nothing to do with this. I did not know where the money came from." Spencer physically recoiled from her touch, as if she were made of acid. He took a deliberate step backward, putting undeniable distance between them. The disgust on his face was visceral. He reached out and grabbed the microphone that was still resting on the table near Gerald. He brought the microphone to his mouth, his hand shaking slightly, with a mixture of rage and profound embarrassment. "Everyone, please listen to me," Spencer said, his voice echoing over the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. The guests instantly quieted down, eager to witness the final act of the tragedy. "What has been revealed here tonight is entirely unacceptable." Spencer continued, his tone turning cold and corporate. "My family operates on trust and absolute transparency. We do not associate with fraud, and we certainly do not marry into it." He turned to look directly at Brittany. His eyes were devoid of any affection. "I am officially calling off this engagement," he announced flatly. The wedding is permanently canceled. I want you and your parents out of this hotel immediately. The collective gasp from the room was deafening. This was a social execution. Brittany stood perfectly still for a fraction of a second, her brain completely unable to process the absolute finality of his words. No, she shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat like a wounded animal. No, Spencer, you cannot do this. We love each other. We are supposed to move into the manor. You promised me. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his custom tuxedo. You are just upset about the emails, she pleaded, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. I can change the design. We can keep the stupid mahogany staircase. Just please do not leave me. Spencer roughly grabbed her wrists and peeled her hands off his jacket. It is not about the staircase, Brittany. He spat, his voice laced with pure venom. It is about the fact that you are a greedy, entitled fraud. We are done. Do not ever contact me again. He turned his back on her and walked swiftly down the steps of the head table, joining his father and Leo. Harrison gave his son a brief, stiff nod of approval before signaling to his executive team that it was time to leave. Brittany watched him walk away, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged terror. The realization that she had just lost the Thornton fortune, the manor, and her entire social standing hit her all at once. Her breathing became jagged and shallow. She looked out at the sea of guests. A dozen cell phones were already raised in the air, their camera lenses focused directly on her. The elite society she had worshipped her entire life was actively recording her absolute destruction. Something deep inside Brittany's mind completely snapped. She let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed violently through the five-star venue. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was a scream of pure, unrestrained rage. She spun around and launched herself at her parents. "This is your fault," she roared, slamming her hands against Gerald's chest. "You ruined my life. You stupid, incompetent fools. Why did you not just pay her the money? Why did you have to steal it and leave a paper trail?" Gerald stumbled backward, holding his hands up in a desperate attempt to defend himself. "Brittany, sweetheart, please calm down," he begged, his voice trembling. "People are watching." Brittany did not care who was watching. The golden child had been stripped of her gold, and she was going to burn the entire room down with her. She grabbed the heavy crystal wine glass my mother had knocked over and hurled it across the stage. It shattered against the projection screen, raining glass down onto the floor. Beatrice reached out to grab her daughter's arm, sobbing uncontrollably. "We were just trying to give you the best life," Beatrice wailed. "We did it all for you." Brittany violently shoved her mother away. Beatrice lost her footing and fell hard onto the polished wooden floor of the stage, her magenta gown twisting awkwardly around her legs. "I hate you," Brittany screamed down at her mother, her face contorted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of fury. "You are pathetic. You dragged me down with you. You stole from that miserable floor cleaner, and you could not even hide it properly. Now I have nothing. I am the laughingstock of the city because of you." She began to tear at her own dress, pulling frantically at the heavy layers of tulle and rhinestones, as if the fabric itself were suffocating her. She ripped a massive seam down the side of the bodice, completely unspooling in front of the flashing phone cameras. The guests did not intervene. They simply watched in horrified fascination as the beautiful, sophisticated bride completely lost her grip on reality. The footage was already being uploaded to social media by the younger attendees. The hashtag Thornton Wedding Disaster was likely trending before I even reached the valet stand. I could see people frantically typing away on their screens. Brittany began pacing the stage like a caged tiger, screaming obscenities at the retreating Thornton family, screaming at the caterers who were frozen in fear, and screaming at the guests who were recording her. "You are all jealous of me," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the crowd. "You think you are better than me. I was going to be the lady of the manor. I am better than all of you." Her words devolved into incomprehensible shrieks as two hotel security guards in dark suits rushed down the center aisle. They bounded up the stairs to the head table, grabbing Brittany by the arms to physically restrain her. She fought them wildly, kicking and thrashing with every ounce of her strength, her silver designer dress tearing even further along the beautiful, delicate seams. Gerald tried to intervene, but a third security guard grabbed him by the shoulder. firmly directing him toward the service exit. Beatrice remained on the floor, weeping loudly into her hands, completely shattered by the absolute public rejection of her favorite child. The elite guests began to turn away, gathering their coats and heading for the exits. The once grand rehearsal dinner had rapidly descended into a truly pathetic, highly violent public spectacle. Brittany was dragged off the stage, screaming my name in a fit of absolute terrifying rage. The city's highest society had just witnessed the true nature of my family, and there was absolutely no coming back from it. 3 months passed since that chaotic night at the Grand Monarch Hotel. The fallout from the rehearsal dinner was swift, merciless, and entirely public. The local media seized upon the scandal, immediately fueled by the viral videos of Brittany tearing her own dress apart while screaming at billionaires. The footage circulated endlessly across social media platforms, turning my family into a localized internet spectacle. But the severe social humiliation was merely the opening act of their true punishment. The district attorney did not waste any time. Armed with the meticulously organized forensic audit and the original digitized bank records, Felix and I had provided federal prosecutors moved with ruthless efficiency. They did not need to launch a lengthy investigation because we had already handed them a fully verified bulletproof case on a silver platter. Within 3 weeks of the canceled wedding, Gerald and Beatrice were formally indicted on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft. I watched the complete collapse of their fraudulent empire from a comfortable, detached distance. They had spent their entire lives obsessing over appearances, desperate to maintain the illusion of generational wealth and superiority. Now that very illusion was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. The federal court immediately froze all of their bank accounts and assets linked to the stolen trust fund, which unfortunately for my parents encompassed practically everything they owned. They had built their entire current lifestyle on the foundation of my grandfather's stolen money. Facing multiple felony charges, they needed to hire elite criminal defense attorneys, and those attorneys demanded exorbitant retainer fees up front. To keep their legal team working, my parents were forced to liquidate their entire lives in a matter of weeks. They had to put our childhood home, the sprawling colonial house with the manicured lawn that my mother prized above all else, on the market. Because they were desperate for a rapid cash sale to pay their mounting legal bills, they had to list it for a fraction of its actual market value. A cash buyer swooped in within days, forcing Beatrice and Gerald to pack their belongings into rented moving trucks under the cover of darkness to avoid the stares of their judgmental neighbors. They moved into a cramped, depressing 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, a stark and humiliating downgrade from the luxury they felt they were entitled to. Their beloved country club quietly revoked their memberships, citing a strict moral clauses violation in their foundational charter. The wealthy friends my mother had spent decades carefully cultivating completely abandoned her without a second thought. People who used to eagerly attend her lavish dinner parties now crossed the street to avoid walking past her at the grocery store. Nobody wanted to be associated with accused federal felons who stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from their own child. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Gerald was struggling deeply to cope with the reality of his impending prison sentence. He had always fancied himself a brilliant strategist, a smooth-talking man who could manipulate his way out of any corner. But federal prosecutors did not care about his country club charm, his tailored suits, or his confident demeanor. They only cared about the irrefutable paper trail, and the paper trail we handed them was absolute. Both of my parents were facing a minimum of 7 years in federal prison, and their lawyers had already informed them that taking a restrictive plea deal was their only viable option to avoid spending the rest of their natural lives locked behind bars. While Gerald and Beatrice were drowning in severe legal consequences, Brittany was experiencing her own spectacular, agonizing free fall. When Spencer Thornton walked away from her that night on the stage, he took her entire future with him. He completely severed all contact, blocking her phone number and instructing Thornton Corporate Security to turn her away immediately if she ever showed up at any of their commercial or residential properties. Without Spencer, and with my parents' assets completely frozen by the federal government, Brittany was abruptly cut off from the only financial life support she had ever known. The private trust account that my parents had illegally established for her using my inheritance was immediately seized as material evidence by the district attorney. For the first time in her 29 years of life, the golden child had absolutely zero access to stolen wealth or parental bailouts. Her pristine designer wardrobe, her luxury car leases, and her expensive weekly beauty routines vanished overnight. The bank repossessed her sleek convertible when the payments stopped clearing. She tried desperately to reach out to the wealthy bridesmaids she had carefully selected for the wedding, hoping to crash on their plush couches or borrow enough money to stay afloat, but she found herself entirely shut out. The high society circle she had sacrificed so much to infiltrate wanted absolutely nothing to do with a disgraced viral bride whose family was headed straight to federal prison. She was a total social pariah, a cautionary tale whispered about at the very elite parties she used to dominate with her cruel arrogance. Stripped of her stolen money, and her wealthy fiancé Brittany was forced to face the harsh reality of survival. She had no actual skills, no college degree, and a work history consisting entirely of failed boutique businesses funded by embezzlement. With mounting credit card debt and rent due on her own small apartment, she had no choice but to enter the workforce at the absolute bottom. I actually saw her once, about 2 months after the indictments were handed down. I was picking up a specialized order of architectural drafting supplies at a large retail chain on the other side of town. I walked up to the customer service desk to retrieve my items, and there she was. Brittany was standing behind the tall counter wearing a stiff, unflattering khaki uniform polo shirt and a plastic name tag. Her previously perfect blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, defeated ponytail. She was in the middle of being berated by an angry customer over an expired coupon for printer ink. I stood a few yards away, completely unnoticed, and simply watched her for a moment. The contrast was staggering. This was the exact same woman who had sent me unhinged emails demanding the demolition of $1 million mahogany staircase. This was the woman who had threatened to have my prestigious firm fired because I refused to break federal preservation laws for her aesthetic pleasure. Now she was staring blankly at a cash register screen, apologizing repeatedly to a middle-aged man over a $2 discount, entirely trapped in a life of grueling minimum wage customer service. When she finally handed the angry customer his receipt, she looked up and our eyes met across the brightly lit store. The scanner in her hand slipped and hit the counter with a loud clatter. Her face flushed a deep, agonizing red, a mixture of profound shame and lingering resentment. She looked down at her cheap khaki uniform, and then she looked at my tailored wool coat and the expensive leather briefcase resting in my hand. There was no screaming this time. There were no arrogant threats or demands for respect. She simply looked away, her shoulders slumping forward in absolute crushing defeat. She turned her back to me and began nervously reorganizing a display of batteries just to avoid making eye contact again. I did not walk over to gloat. I did not say a single word to her. The punishment she was currently living was far worse than any insult I could possibly deliver. She was trapped in the exact miserable paycheck-to-paycheck existence she used to mock, while the sister she called a floor cleaner continued to run a massive architectural empire. I picked up my heavy box of drafting supplies, turned around, and walked out of the store into the bright afternoon sunlight, leaving the golden child behind in the fluorescent aisles of her own making. The scales of justice had finally balanced themselves, and the universe had exacted a heavy toll on the people who had tried to build their paradise on my suffering. I did not look back as I walked to my car. In the past, I might have harbored fantasies of delivering a crushing final monologue to my sister, of standing over her and demanding she acknowledge every cruel thing she had ever said to me. But seeing her there, completely stripped of her unearned arrogance, I realized that any further retaliation would only tether me to her misery. I had spent 12 years fighting to escape the gravity of my family's toxicity. Gloating would just pull me back into their orbit. I simply started my engine and drove back to my office, leaving the justice system to handle the rest of their consequences. The federal prosecutors did exactly what they promised. 2 weeks later, Gerald and Beatrice officially pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. Taking the plea deal spared them a lengthy, humiliating public trial, but it did not spare them from federal prison. Gerald received a sentence of 8 years while my mother received 6. The judge showed no leniency, explicitly citing their predatory exploitation of their own child as an aggravating factor in his sentencing decision. When the gavel finally fell, I was not in the courtroom. I did not need to witness them being led away in handcuffs to feel a sense of closure. The closure had already happened the moment I dropped that leather folder onto the rehearsal dinner table. They were completely erased from my life, no longer a looming threat or a source of anxiety. They were simply a closed chapter in a book I never had to read again. My focus shifted entirely back to where it truly belonged. Thornton Manor was a hive of meticulous, highly coordinated activity. The crisp autumn air blew through the massive open doors of the grand hall, carrying the rich scents of aged oak, fresh linseed oil, and construction dust. The estate was coming back to life, breathing again after a decade of silent neglect. I walked across the main foyer, my footsteps echoing softly against the original marble tiles we had spent weeks carefully uncovering and polishing by hand. I wore my standard work attire, a pair of durable canvas pants, a heavy utility shirt, and my scuffed steel-toed boots. I stopped at the base of the magnificent hand-carved mahogany grand staircase. It was the exact staircase Brittany had demanded we destroy, the piece of history she had deemed too ugly for her modern sensibilities. Now it stood proudly at the center of the estate, bathed in the natural light pouring through the newly restored stained glass windows above. I reached out and ran my scarred left hand over the smooth, polished surface of the mahogany banister. I could feel the intricate grooves of the wood under my fingertips, a testament to the master craftsman who had built it over a century ago. The wood was solid, immovable, and beautiful because of its history, not in spite of it. Felix walked into the grand hall carrying a thick roll of updated architectural schematics under his arm. He paused near the entryway, taking in the sweeping progress our team had made over the last few months. He walked over to join me at the base of the staircase, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. "We are 2 days ahead of schedule," Felix announced, unrolling the blueprints. The masonry team finished reinforcing the West Wing foundation this morning, and the plaster artisans are moving into the library to begin the final detail work on the ceiling fresco. I nodded, feeling a deep, resonating sense of professional pride. "We need to make sure the plaster team has adequate ventilation in the library," I replied, keeping my eyes on the upper landing. "Let us bring in the secondary exhaust fans from the warehouse before they start the chemical sealant process. I do not want anyone breathing in those fumes." Felix made a quick note on his clipboard, his demeanor reflecting the absolute respect and easy partnership we had cultivated over the past decade. He did not question my directives, and I never doubted his operational execution. We had built a company culture based on trust, competence, and mutual support. The foreman of the masonry crew, a burly man named David, walked past us carrying a heavy toolbox. He immediately offered a warm, respectful nod in my direction. "Morning, boss," David called out cheerfully. "The new stone shipments just arrived at the loading dock. The color match on the granite is absolutely perfect." "Thank you, David," I called back, returning his smile. "Tell the unloading crew to take all their time safely." The brief interaction was simple, but it filled my chest with a profound warmth. I was surrounded by a team of highly skilled, hardworking people who respected me, not because of a wealthy last name, but because I had earned their loyalty in the trenches alongside them. I had built a true support system, replacing the broken family I had been born into with a family of my own choosing. The sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway drew my attention toward the main entrance. A sleek black luxury SUV pulled up to the front steps of the manor. The driver's side door opened, and Leo Thornton stepped out into the crisp morning air. He was dressed in a casual cashmere sweater and dark jeans, looking completely at ease as he walked through the massive double doors of the grand hall. He was carrying a cardboard tray, holding 3 large steaming cups of coffee. Leo spotted me standing near the staircase, and his face lit up with a bright, boyish grin. "I come bearing the good stuff," Leo announced, holding the tray up like a trophy, as he walked across the marble floor. I stopped at that small independent roaster you recommended across town. You were absolutely right about their new espresso blend. I stepped away from the banister to meet him, a genuine laugh escaping my lips. I reached out and took one of the warm cups from the tray. You did not have to drive all the way out here just to bring us coffee, Leo. I am sure you have corporate board meetings you should be attending. Leo shrugged, handing the second cup to Felix before taking a sip from his own. My father can handle the board meetings today. I wanted to see the progress on the manor for myself. Besides, any excuse to get out of the city and come see my favorite architect is a good enough reason for me. His words were very light and teasing, but the look in his eyes held that same deep, unwavering gratitude I had seen on the night of the rehearsal dinner. He did not look at me like I was a broken victim or a tragic charity case. He looked at me with absolute respect, seeing the woman who had bravely saved his life and the professional who was currently saving his family legacy. He wandered over to the mahogany staircase, looking up at the woodwork with a sense of quiet awe. "This place is going to be magnificent when you are finished," Leo said softly. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the rich aroma of coffee and the scent of aged wood fill my lungs. I looked down at my left hand at the thick white scar running across my palm. It was no longer a mark of abandonment. It was the physical proof of my survival. I had walked through the fire and come out on the other side completely whole. I took a sip of coffee, feeling warmth spread through my chest, and turned to the blueprints ready to build my empire. Looking back on the 12 years since I was thrown out into the rain, the greatest lesson I learned is that you never have to prove your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. For over a decade, my family tried to write my story for me. They cast me as the failure, the scapegoat, and the outcast, all to protect their own fragile lies and stolen wealth. But I discovered that the most powerful revenge isn't found in screaming back, seeking retaliation, or begging for their validation. It is found in absolute, undeniable success built in total silence. When toxic people try to tear you down, let them underestimate you. Use that quiet space to build your own empire, protect your peace, and find your chosen family. You do not owe your abusers a front row seat to your recovery. The truth always has a remarkable way of coming to light, and when it does, your character will stand unshakable while their house of cards collapses. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace and build your true life? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, boundaries, and reclaiming your power. Remember, you are the architect of your own life.